A billionaire found his future wife in a garbage dump. Skolola thought marriage meant safety. She had no idea her wedding dress would become her burial shroud, her vows would turn into chains, and her husband would literally throw her away like trash. But what happened in that stinking Lagos garbage site wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of the most shocking transformation you'll ever witness. When a Mecha Japan's headlights cut through rain that night, illuminating a broken woman among rotting refuse, he had no idea he was about to rescue Nigeria's future queen of compassion. The woman discarded like garbage would soon own the very house that imprisoned her. The orphan with no voice would become the voice for thousands of voiceless women. Stay with us to discover how a marriage built on greed became a love story that defied every expectation. You'll witness the moment when a billionaire's heart shattered at the sight of human cruelty. Learn how an abused wife became her abuser's landlord, and uncover the stunning way revenge transformed into forgiveness that changed an entire nation. Because this isn't just about a woman who survived domestic violence. It's about the mysterious forces that lift us from our lowest points, the unexpected people who see treasure where others see trash, and the power of grace to turn our deepest wounds into our greatest strengths. The truth waiting in this story will leave you questioning everything you believe about justice, love, and the incredible ways broken hearts can be rebuilt stronger than ever before. The cathedral bells chimed with mechanical precision on that humid Lagos morning, their bronze voices echoing across Victoria Island like a funeral dirge disguised as celebration. But inside St. Augustine's Cathedral, what unfolded was no celebration at all. It was a transaction, cold and calculated as any stock exchange deal, dressed in white lace and empty promises. Skolola Aduni stood in the cathedral's cramped preparation room, her reflection fractured in an antique mirror that had witnessed countless brides' final moments of innocence. The borrowed wedding dress hung loose on her small frame, its yellowed lace telling stories of other women's dreams. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted the veil, not from excitement, but from the bone-deep understanding that she was about to disappear forever. "Stop fidgeting!" Chief Jaidaduni barked from behind her, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You look presentable enough." Presentable enough. Those words would echo in Sholola's mind for years to come. Not beautiful, not radiant, not loved, just presentable enough for a business merger disguised as a marriage. Chief Jaid straightened his agbada with the same attention he gave to his ledgers. At 62, he was a man who measured everything in profit margins and quarterly reports. Love, joy, human dignity. These were luxuries he couldn't afford, especially not for an orphan niece who'd been nothing but an expense since her parents died in that bus accident when she was 7. "Remember," he continued, checking his gold Rolex, "you represent my business interests now. The Aduni name has value. Don't depreciate it." Sholola nodded silently, the way she'd learned to respond to everything in the 15 years since becoming Chief Jaid's reluctant ward. Speaking had never been encouraged in his house. Opinions were definitely not solicited. She existed to be grateful, obedient, and invisible, until the moment came when her existence could finally serve a purpose. That purpose had crystallized 3 months ago in Chief Jaid's air-conditioned office, where ceiling fans whirred like helicopter blades and money talks never stopped. Chief Femi Ogundipe needed a wife for his wayward son, Beaufet. Chief Jaid needed a contract for his shipping business. A marriage would seal both deals with the efficiency of a well-negotiated merger. "The boy has his challenges," Chief Femi had admitted during their initial meeting, his euphemism floating in the air like expensive cologne, trying to mask an unpleasant odor. "But he comes from good stock. Your niece will want for nothing." Chief Jide had smiled the way sharks smile before feeding. "Skolola understands her duty. She's grateful for the opportunity." Neither man had bothered to ask Sholola what she understood or what she was grateful for. Her consent was assumed, purchased, and packaged, with the same attention given to shipping containers full of goods bound for foreign ports. Now, standing in this suffocating preparation room, Sholola could hear the cathedral filling with guests who'd come not to witness love, but to network. Chief Jide's business associates mixed with Chief Femi's political connections, all of them understanding that this wedding was really a boardroom meeting with better catering. Through the thin walls, she could hear Chief Jide's voice, rising above the murmur of conversation as he discussed shipping routes with a potential client. But even on her wedding day, business never stopped. She was just another item on his agenda, scheduled between a breakfast meeting and a round of golf. The church organist began warming up, filling the cathedral with practice chords that sounded more like questions than announcements. Each note seemed to ask, "Are you sure? Do you really want to do this? Is there no other way?" But Sholola had learned long ago that questioning led to consequences she couldn't afford. Chief Jide's house had rules as rigid as concrete. Be grateful for everything. Complain about nothing. Accept whatever life gives you, because beggars can't be choosers. And she was definitely a beggar. An orphan with no dowry, no family connections, no options except the ones provided by Chief Jide's calculated generosity. She'd been reminded of this fact every day for 15 years, during school fee discussions, clothing allowances, and meals that came with lectures about gratitude. Your parents left you nothing but debt and funeral expenses, Chief Jide would say, whenever she showed the slightest hint of independence. Everything you have, you owe to me. Remember that. So she remembered. She remembered when she wanted to study literature instead of business. She remembered when she dreamed of traveling beyond Lagos. She remembered when she imagined marrying someone who might actually love her. Each memory was carefully filed away in the drawer marked "Impossible Things," until the drawer grew so heavy she stopped opening it altogether. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Madam, they are ready for you," announced Mama Kemi, the church coordinator, her face wearing the expression of someone who'd overseen too many weddings to believe in fairy tales anymore. Chief Jide adjusted his agbada one final time and offered Sholola his arm with the same enthusiasm he might show for an unpleasant medical procedure. "Time to earn your keep," he muttered under his breath. They walked through the cathedral's side corridor, past stained glass windows depicting saints who looked down with expressions of eternal disappointment. Skolola wondered if they were disappointed in her for being too weak to refuse, or in the world for making such refusal impossible. The main aisle stretched before them like a runway to nowhere. At the altar stood Father Monsignor Akinola, whose perpetual frown suggested he'd already calculated how much this particular union would cost everyone involved. To his left waited Bofe Ogundipe, 28 years old, and radiating the kind of entitled boredom that came from never having to work for anything important. Bofe checked his phone twice during the processional, his attention more focused on whatever notification had just arrived than on the woman walking toward him to pledge her life away. When he finally looked up, his gaze swept over Sholola with the dispassionate assessment of someone inspecting a purchase they'd already agreed to make. The congregation rose with the enthusiasm of people attending a corporate presentation. Chief Femi sat in the front row, his smile tight with the strain of maintaining appearances. His wife, resplendent in gold jewel and matching jewelry, whispered something to her neighbor that made both women laugh quietly behind their fans. Chief Jide's associates filled several rows, their conversations about shipping manifests and customs regulations continuing in undertones even as the ceremony began. This was networking time, and no vow was sacred enough to interrupt a potentially profitable connection. As Sholola reached the altar, she caught Beaufais's eye for just a moment. What she saw there made her stomach clench with recognition. He was looking at her the way Chief Jide looked at balance sheets, with mild interest and the assumption of complete control. Father Monsignor Akinola cleared his throat and began the ceremony with words worn smooth by repetition. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Beaufais Ogundipe and Sholola Aduni in holy matrimony. Holy. The word hung in the air like incense, sweet-smelling but ultimately empty. Nothing about this transaction felt holy. It felt like commerce dressed in religious clothing, profit margins disguised as divine blessing. Marriage, the priest continued, is a sacred institution founded on love, respect, and mutual devotion. Love, respect, mutual devotion. Skolola wondered if Father Monsignor actually believed the words he was speaking, or if he'd learned to separate his job from his conscience the way surgeons learned to cut without feeling. The ceremony proceeded with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed corporate presentation. Prayers were recited like mission statements. Hymns were sung like company songs. Even the Bible readings sounded like terms and conditions being read aloud before signing a contract. When Father Monsignor reached the part about speaking now or forever holding peace, silence fell over the cathedral like a heavy blanket. Sholola felt the words rising in her throat like bile. I object. I don't want this. Please, someone save me. But Chief Jide's grip on her arm tightened with subtle warning, and the words died unspoken. Forever holding peace. The phrase took on new meaning as she realized this might be her last chance to speak her truth, and she was choosing silence instead. I object. The words escaped before she could stop them, small and frightened but unmistakably real. They echoed off the marble pillars like gunshots, shattering the carefully maintained facade of propriety. The congregation gasped in unison. Chief Femi half rose from his seat. Beaufais's mouth fell open in surprise. Even Father Monsignor seemed momentarily speechless, his prayer book trembling in his hands. But it was Chief Jide's reaction that sealed Sholola's fate. His fingers dug into her arm with enough force to leave bruises, and his voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. You will not destroy my business. Say you were confused. Now, the weight of 15 years of dependency crashed down on her shoulders. The faces of the congregation blurred through sudden tears. Chief Jide's grip tightened until she thought her arm might break. And in that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people, Sholola had never felt more alone. I was confused, she whispered, the lie tasting like poison on her tongue. Please continue. Father Monsignor's relief was palpable as he resumed the ceremony. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard her moment of rebellion, and everyone had witnessed its swift defeat. The message was clear. This was not a union of equals, but a transfer of ownership from one man to another. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of traditional responses and hollow promises. When Beaufais kissed her at the end, his lips were cold and perfunctory, sealing their business arrangement with all the passion of a handshake. Rice fell like rain as they exited the cathedral, each grain feeling like a small stone against Sholola's skin. The photographer posed them for pictures that would later hang in Chief Jide's office as proof of a successful negotiation. In every photo, Sholola's smile looked like a grimace, and Beaufait's attention was already wandering toward his next distraction. The reception was held at the Lagos Island Club, where crystal champagne flutes reflected the faces of people celebrating a victory that had nothing to do with love. Speeches were made about family unity and business prosperity. Toasts were raised to the future success of both the Aduni and Ogundipe enterprises. No one toasted the bride's happiness. No one mentioned love. No one seemed to notice that Sholola barely touched her food, or that she flinched every time Beaufait casually placed his hand on her shoulder, like a mark of ownership. As the evening wore on, the reality of her situation began to settle over Sholola like a heavy shroud. She was no longer Sholola Aduni, the orphan who'd managed to maintain some small sense of self, despite Chief Jide's control. She was now Mrs. Beaufait Ogundipe, a title that felt like a prison sentence disguised as an honor. When the last guest had departed and the last business card had been exchanged, Beaufait loosened his tie and looked at his new wife with the expression of someone who just remembered an item on his to-do list. "Come on," he said, and not bothering to offer his arm or help her navigate the wedding dress that had been designed more for photographs than for walking. Time to go home. Home. The word should have filled her with anticipation, or at least curiosity about her new life. Instead, it filled her with dread, because as they drove through the Lagos night toward Beaufait's duplex on Victoria Island, Skolola realized that she wasn't going to a home at all. She was going to a prison with an address and a mortgage, where the bars were made of expectation and the locks were forged from financial dependency. The woman who'd entered St. Augustine's Cathedral that morning as Skolola Aduni was gone forever, replaced by a wife whose only job was to be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity her husband chose to leave her. The cathedral bells had stopped ringing hours ago, but their echo seemed to follow her into the night, a funeral dirge for the dreams she'd never dared to speak aloud and the hope she'd never learned to properly hold. The duplex on Victoria Island rose from the Lagos Lagoon like a monument to modern success, its stark white walls gleaming under strategically placed security lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows promised panoramic views of wealth and privilege, while manicured gardens whispered of money that grew as reliably as the tropical plants, carefully maintained by an army of invisible staff. But as Sholola stepped across the threshold for the first time as Mrs. Beaufait Ogundipe, the beauty felt cold and unwelcoming, like walking into a museum where she was both the newest exhibit and the least valuable artifact. "Welcome to your new home," Beaufait announced with the enthusiasm of someone giving a tour to a business acquaintance. His tie hung loose around his neck, and the scent of champagne from the reception still clung to his breath like an expensive cologne that had soured. The interior was a masterpiece of contemporary design. Italian marble floors that reflected light like mirrors, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, and furniture that looked beautiful but uninviting, as if comfort had been sacrificed on the altar of aesthetics. Skolola's bare feet whispered against the cold marble as she followed Beaufait through rooms that felt more like magazine spreads than living spaces. The living room was dominated by a massive sectional sofa in pristine white leather, positioned to face both a wall-mounted television the size of a small billboard and the panoramic windows overlooking the lagoon. "The maid comes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays," Beaufait said, checking his phone as he spoke. "She'll handle the cleaning and laundry. The cook comes daily except Sundays. That's your day to manage meals, Try not to burn the house down. He spoke about her domestic responsibilities with the casual authority of someone discussing terms with an employee, which, Sholola was beginning to realize, was exactly what she was. The marriage certificate hadn't made her a wife. It had made her a live-in manager of Beaufait's domestic comfort. The master bedroom is upstairs, he continued, already heading toward the floating staircase that curved elegantly to the second floor. Your things from Chief Jide's house should arrive tomorrow. I told them to put everything in the guest room for now. You can sort through what's worth keeping. The casual dismissal of her possessions, meager as they were, stung more than Sholola had expected. In Chief Jide's house, she'd owned almost nothing, but those few items had been hers. Books purchased with carefully saved allowance money, photographs of her parents, a jewelry box that had belonged to her mother. Now even these small treasures were being relegated to temporary storage until Beaufait decided their worth. The master bedroom was a study in masculine luxury, dark wood furniture, black leather accents, and art that featured sharp angles and muted colors. The king-sized bed dominated the space, its black silk sheets looking more like a business proposal than a marriage bed. Beaufait walked to the walk-in closet and emerged with a scarlet silk nightgown that he tossed across the bed with the casualness of someone distributing uniforms. "Wear something appropriate tomorrow," he said, unfastening his cufflinks with practiced efficiency. "I'm having lunch with some business associates at the yacht club. I can't have you looking like Charity." Looking like Charity. The words hit Sholola like a physical blow, partly because they were cruel, and partly because they contained just enough truth to make them devastating. Her wedding dress had been borrowed. Her shoes were hand-me-downs from Chief Jide's wife. Even her underwear had been purchased from a discount store because Chief Jide believed in practical rather than pretty. But what hurt most was the realization that Beaufait saw her exactly the way Chief Jide had, as a burden made temporarily useful, an expense that might occasionally justify its cost. She'd foolishly hoped that marriage might mean something different, that a husband might see value where an uncle saw only obligation. "Thank you," she whispered, the words automatic and empty. Gratitude had become her default response to everything, even insults disguised as gifts. Beaufait was already in the bathroom, the sound of running water suggesting a shower that would wash away any remnants of their wedding day. Sholola sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing her borrowed dress, and tried to process the reality of her new life. The nightgown felt like silk and shame mixed together, beautiful and humiliating in equal measure. It was clearly expensive, probably more costly than anything she'd ever owned. But it came with strings attached, strings that felt suspiciously like chains. Through the bathroom door, she could hear Beaufait humming something tuneless, apparently unburdened by any concerns about his new wife's comfort or happiness. The sound made her feel more alone than she'd ever felt in Chief Jide's house, because at least there she'd understood her place. Here she was discovering that marriage had simply relocated her servitude to more expensive surroundings. The master bedroom had 15 windows. She counted them that first night, lying awake on sheets that smelled like expensive detergent and empty promises. Each window was equipped with brass latches that gleamed like gold in the moonlight, and each latch represented another way she was being separated from the outside world. Beaufait's nightly ritual began that very first evening. As the sun set over Lagos Lagoon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that should have been romantic, he moved methodically from window to window, turning each brass latch with a click that echoed through the bedroom like a countdown to imprisonment. Security, he explained when he caught her watching. "Victoria Island can be dangerous at night. I'm protecting you." But protection and imprisonment often wore the same face, and as Skolola listened to the systematic clicking of locks, she began to understand that her new home was just another type of cage, larger than Chief Jide's house, more beautifully decorated, but a cage nonetheless. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of small humiliations and careful adjustments. Skolola learned that Beaufay's moods were as predictable as Lagos traffic, frustrating, unpredictable, and always somehow her fault. Monday mornings brought complaints about the bathroom smelling too feminine, an accusation that made no sense, until Sholola realized that even her presence was being criticized. She learned to shower quickly and open windows to ensure no trace of her existence lingered in the air. Tuesday evenings featured dinner critiques that would have made restaurant critics blush. No matter what she prepared, it was either bland as borehole water or too spicy for civilized tongues. Both verdicts ended the same way, with Beaufay scraping perfectly good food into the garbage disposal while lecturing her about the standards expected in a proper household. Wednesdays, he simply didn't come home, sending brisk text messages that read like inter-office memos. "Business drinks. Don't wait up." The formality of the messages hurt almost as much as the abandonment they announced. Thursdays, he returned wearing unfamiliar perfume, humming club anthems that spoke of nightlife experiences she wasn't invited to share. The scent of other women clung to his clothes like evidence of a crime she wasn't allowed to investigate. But Fridays were the worst. Fridays brought Beaufay home drunk, his cheeks flushed with alcohol and arrogance, brandishing new insults he'd apparently rehearsed during his evening out. These weren't spur-of-the-moment cruelties. They were carefully crafted weapons designed to inflict maximum damage with surgical precision. "Do orphans even know how to love?" he asked one Friday night. The question delivered with the casual brutality of someone discussing the weather. "I mean, how can you give what you've never received?" The question haunted Sholola for days, not because it was necessarily true, but because it touched a fear she'd carried since childhood, that losing her parents had somehow broken her capacity for normal human connection, that love was a language she'd never properly learned, and therefore could never properly speak. She began keeping a diary, writing in the margins of an old notebook she'd salvaged from her school days. The entries started simply, records of daily humiliations and small survival victories, but gradually evolved into something deeper. A conversation with the person she used to be before marriage made her disappear. June 3rd. He snapped because the water glass had fingerprints. "I cleaned them all again." June 10th. He said my voice could curdle milk. "I haven't spoken since Tuesday." June 24th. He asked if orphans even know how to love. "What is the price of silence?" Each entry ended with that same question, written in increasingly shaky handwriting as the weeks passed. What is the price of silence? But she never wrote the answer, because she was living it every day. The price of silence was everything. Her voice, her dignity, her sense of self, her hope for something better. The diary became her confessor, the only safe place to admit the thoughts that would bring punishment if spoken aloud. In its pages, she could be honest about the growing fear that she might not survive this marriage, not because Beaufay would kill her body, but because he was slowly and systematically murdering her soul. The house staff treated her with the polite distance reserved for temporary fixtures. They called her Madam, but looked through her as if she were furniture that might be rearranged at any moment. Even the cook, Mama Sola, who'd been with the family for years, offered only the minimum courtesy required by her position. "Oga likes his jollof rice with extra pepper," Mama Sola informed her during their first kitchen interaction. "Not too much tomato. And he doesn't like to see you in here when he's eating." The message was clear. Skolola might be the wife on paper, but the house had its own hierarchy, and she ranked somewhere below the appliances in terms of importance. She was a guest in her own home, a visitor whose welcome could be revoked at any moment. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Chief Jide called exactly once after the wedding, not to check on her well-being, but to confirm that the shipping contracts were progressing as expected. When she tried to inject some warmth into the conversation, to hint at her loneliness, he cut her off with characteristic efficiency. "Marriage requires adjustment," he said briskly. "You'll adapt. The Aduni name is now represented in the Ogundipe family. Don't disappoint me." The line went dead before she could respond, leaving her with the dial tone's mechanical sympathy and the growing realization that she truly had no one. Chief Jide had traded her away like a business asset, and now his concern extended only to ensuring she didn't depreciate in value. Even her few friends from church had drifted away, partly because of distance and partly because married women were expected to find their social circle through their husbands. But Beaufet never included her in his social activities, never introduced her to his friends' wives, never suggested she might need human connection beyond their increasingly toxic marriage. The windows of the duplex became both her view of freedom and her reminder of captivity. She could see life happening beyond the glass, children playing on the beach, couples walking hand in hand along the lagoon, families sharing picnics under weekend sunsets. But she was separated from all of it by more than just window panes. At night, after Beaufet completed his ritual locking of the latches, Skolola would lie awake, counting the ways she'd become invisible. Her voice had been silenced, her opinions had been deemed irrelevant. Her presence had been reduced to its functional components: cooking, cleaning, sexual availability when requested. She was disappearing piece by piece. And the most terrifying part was how easily everyone, including herself, was accepting the vanishing act. It was becoming normal to be treated like furniture. It was becoming routine to have her humanity questioned. It was becoming natural to believe that this was all she deserved. But late at night, when Lagos fell quiet, and only the lagoon's gentle lapping broke the silence, Skolola would whisper to herself the words she couldn't say aloud. "I am still here. I am still me. I matter." Whether she believed these words was another question entirely, but saying them felt like a small act of rebellion, a tiny flame flickering in an ocean of darkness. And sometimes, when the loneliness threatened to consume her entirely, that small flame was the only thing that kept her from disappearing completely. The duplex had 15 windows and 150 ways to feel alone. Skolola was learning to count them all. 3 months into her marriage, Skolola discovered that fear had its own biology. Her body had learned to predict Beaufet's moods with the accuracy of a meteorologist reading storm patterns. The sound of his key in the lock sent her heart racing. The tone of his voice when he called her name determined whether she could breathe normally or had to suppress the instinct to run. But the fear that now clawed at her chest was different, deeper and more desperate than anything she'd experienced before. It wasn't just about bruises that could heal or insults that could be forgotten. This was about survival in the most literal sense. The discovery came by accident, the way most life-changing revelations do. Skolola was gathering laundry on a Tuesday morning, the kind of muggy Lagos morning when the air hung heavy with unfulfilled promises of rain. She moved quietly through the bedroom, collecting Beaufet's discarded clothes with the careful efficiency she'd perfected to avoid disturbing his sleep. From the pocket of his navy trousers, a crumpled paper fell to the marble floor, with a whisper that seemed to echo through the room like thunder. Sciolola glanced at the bed where Beaufet lay sleeping off another night of business drinks, then picked up the paper with fingers that had learned to handle evidence of his secret life. It was a pharmacy receipt, rumpled and stained with what looked like coffee, but the line items made Sciolola's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Azithromycin, 500 milligrams cefixime, 200 milligrams metronidazole, 400 milligrams. Even with her limited medical knowledge, Sciolola recognized these names from the health education classes she'd attended at the orphanage. These weren't vitamins or pain relievers. These were antibiotics, the kind prescribed for sexually transmitted infections. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the receipt trembling in her hands like a leaf in a hurricane. The dates on the prescription were recent, just 2 weeks ago, around the time Beaufet had spent 3 consecutive nights away from home, claiming urgent business meetings that couldn't be postponed. The mathematics of betrayal began calculating themselves in her mind. If Beaufet had been treated for infections, and if he were still sharing her bed without protection, then her own health was in jeopardy. The man who claimed to love her enough to marry her was potentially exposing her to diseases that could damage her body permanently or even cost her life. Sciolola sat on that bed for an hour, the receipt burning in her palm like radioactive evidence of her husband's reckless disregard for her safety. She wasn't naive about his infidelity. The perfume, the late nights, the phone calls taken in private had painted a clear picture, but she'd assumed his affairs were emotional betrayals, painful but not physically dangerous. This was different. This was biological warfare disguised as marriage. When she finally moved, it was to kneel beside the bed where she'd spent so many sleepless nights. The prayer that escaped her lips was raw and desperate. God, I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want to die. Not like this. Please help me find the courage to save myself. That evening, Sciolola did something she hadn't done in months. She cooked with love instead of resignation, grilled turkey wings, seasoned with ginger and thyme. Yam porridge, rich with palm oil and stockfish. Peppered snails that filled the kitchen with the kind of aroma that could make even the angriest man pause and remember why food was called comfort. She dressed carefully in a yellow wrapper with delicate floral patterns, one of the few items Beaufet hadn't criticized or thrown away. She braided her hair the way her mother used to, weaving in small hopes that tonight might be different. That conversation might be possible. Beaufet arrived home at 10:40 p.m., slightly drunk, but not aggressively so. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he carried the familiar scent of whiskey and another woman's perfume, like a cologne designed to announce infidelity. But for once, Sciolola didn't flinch away from the evidence of his betrayal. "Welcome home," she said softly, helping him remove his jacket with hands that had learned to serve without expecting gratitude. He grunted acknowledgement and slumped into the dining chair like a king, exhausted by the burden of his own superiority. When he tasted the food, something resembling approval flickered across his features. "Not bad," he admitted grudgingly. "You didn't mess it up today." It was the closest thing to a compliment Sciolola had received in months, and she clung to it like a life-preserver in a storm. After he'd eaten, she brought him water and sat across from him, her hands twisted together in her lap, like prayer beads worn smooth by desperation. "Beaufet," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" His eyes sharpened with suspicion, the way they always did when she initiated any conversation beyond the functional exchanges their marriage had become. About what? Sciolola had rehearsed this moment in her mind for hours, searching for words that might penetrate his armor of arrogance, without triggering the rage that always lurked beneath his surface civility. "I know you see other women," she said carefully, each word chosen like a step across a minefield. "I'm not here to fight you or tell you what to do. I just want us to be safe." The question in his eyes was sharp enough to cut glass. Safe how? Her throat felt like it was closing, but she forced the words out. "I found the receipt from the pharmacy. You're treating something, and I understand. These things happen. But please use protection, just so we don't endanger each other's lives." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush buildings. Beaufay stared at her as if she'd suddenly spoken in a foreign language, his mind processing the audacity of his wife, asking for basic consideration for her health and safety. Then he laughed. The sound that emerged from his throat was sharp and mocking, slicing through the moment like a razor blade through silk. It was the laugh of someone discovering an ant had the presumption to negotiate with an elephant. "You, a gutter girl from Motion, giving me advice on protection?" His voice rose with each word, building toward an explosion that Sholola could see coming but couldn't prevent. "Who the hell do you think you are?" She tried to stay calm, to keep her voice gentle and non-threatening. "I'm your wife, and I don't want to die, Beaufay. That's all I'm asking. For us to be careful." The word wife seemed to trigger something volcanic in his chest. His face darkened with a rage that went beyond anger into something more primitive and dangerous. "You ungrateful wretch!" he snarled, rising from his chair with the fluid motion of a predator preparing to strike. And then the explosion came. The first slap struck her left cheek with the force of a car accident, spinning her sideways and sending her crashing to the tiled floor. The taste of copper filled her mouth immediately. Blood from a split lip, mixing with the salt of tears she hadn't realized were falling. But Beaufay wasn't finished. The beast that had been lurking beneath his surface civility had finally been unleashed, and it was hungry for destruction. His foot connected with her ribs with a sickening thud that drove all the air from her lungs. She gasped like a fish pulled from water, curling into a protective ball on the cold tile, while his anger rained down on her in a storm of kicks and curses. "You think you're too wise now?" Each word was punctuated by violence, his voice distorted by rage. "Talking to me like you're my equal?" Sholola tried to cry out, to beg him to stop. But her voice emerged as nothing more than broken whispers. She shielded her face with trembling arms while her husband, the man who'd promised to love and protect her, used her body as a canvas for his fury. When he finally stopped, her head throbbed like a drum beaten by a madman, and her vision blurred with tears and trauma. He grabbed her by the wrist and dragged her across the living room like a discarded piece of furniture, throwing her against the banister with enough force to rattle the crystal chandelier overhead. "You think you can question me in my own house?" he roared, standing over her broken form with the satisfaction of a conqueror surveying his victory. "I am Beaufay Ogundipe. My father owns half of Lagos, and you are nothing but trash I was forced to marry." Blood tasted like iron rain in her mouth. Pain radiated from her ribs like fire spreading through dry grass. But it was the look in his eyes that terrified her most. Not anger, but cold calculation, as if he was deciding whether she was worth keeping alive. Sholola lay curled against the banister until dawn painted the Persian carpet in shades of gray defeat. Somewhere upstairs, Beaufay snored with the peaceful sleep of someone whose conscience had never learned to keep him awake. With monumental effort that felt like lifting mountains, she pushed herself upright and slipped on a faded Ankara wrapper that had been draped over a nearby chair. Her entire body screamed in protest, but something deeper than pain was driving her now. A survival instinct that had been dormant for months but was finally awakening. Her feet were bare, because her shoes were locked in the wardrobe. But the cold driveway stones barely registered through the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Each step toward Chief Jide's house was a declaration of war against the silence that had been slowly killing her. The 6-block trek to Ikoyi felt like a journey across continents. Rain began as she walked. First, a gentle mist that kissed her swollen face, then a tropical torrent that plastered her hair against her skull and turned the streets into rivers of muddy water. Cars hissed past her twice, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like judgment. She almost flagged a taxi, but pride, or perhaps shame, kept her hand pressed to her side. How could she explain to a stranger why she was walking through Lagos at dawn, barefoot and bleeding, fleeing from the man who was supposed to protect her? At the wrought iron gates of Chief Jide's townhouse, 2 security guards exchanged skeptical glances at the drenched, swollen-faced woman standing before them like a ghost from their employer's past. They recognized her, the niece who'd been married off with such ceremony just months ago. But this broken creature bore little resemblance to the obedient bride who'd left their gates in a wedding car. "Tell my uncle," she managed through split lips, "that Sholola is here." The guards radioed inside, their voices carrying the uncomfortable tone of men who'd rather be anywhere else. Minutes passed beneath the punishing downpour, while Sholola stood shivering, her wrapper clinging to her body like a second skin of shame. Finally, Chief Jide emerged beneath a golf umbrella, his silk pajamas immaculate despite the early hour. His appearance was so perfectly groomed that Sholola wondered if he ever actually slept, or simply maintained himself in a constant state of business readiness. "Jesu," he exclaimed when he saw her condition, but his voice carried more annoyance than concern. "What are you doing here? The neighbors will talk." The neighbors. Even in her moment of desperate need, Chief Jide's first concern was maintaining appearances. Sholola felt what remained of her hope beginning to crumble like a sandcastle in the rain. "Uncle, just one night inside," she pleaded, her voice rasping like sandpaper against wood. "I fear he'll kill me." Chief Jide's expression hardened into the mask of cold calculation she remembered from childhood. The look he wore when deciding whether an expense was justified or if a problem was worth solving. "That is a wife's cross to bear," he said with the casual brutality of someone discussing market fluctuations. "Besides, you chose him. The words hit harder than any of Beaufay's punches because they rewrote history with the efficiency of a propaganda machine. She hadn't chosen anything. She'd been sold, traded, bartered like livestock. But admitting that truth would require Chief Jide to acknowledge his own role in her suffering, and wealthy men rarely audited their consciences. The umbrella twitched slightly, repositioning to keep him dry while rain sluiced across her shoulders like liquid accusations. The metaphor was perfect and heartbreaking. Even in her moment of greatest need, she remained outside while he stayed protected. "Go home, Sholola," he commanded, with the finality of a judge passing sentence. "Learn to be a better wife. The merger depends on your marriage succeeding." The gates closed with mechanical precision, their electronic locks sliding home like prison bars. Thunder cracked overhead like celestial gavels, and Sholola staggered back toward the road, with her heart disintegrating with each footstep. The walk back to Victoria Island felt like a death march through the remnants of her shattered illusions. Every step was a small funeral for the hope that someone, somewhere, might value her life above business profits. The rain continued its assault, turning her path into a river of mud and broken dreams. By the time she reached the duplex, dawn was glimmering through retreating clouds like a reluctant witness to her defeat. She found the front door locked from within. Another small cruelty in a night full of them. Too weak to scale the low wall surrounding the property, she sank onto the welcome mat that proclaimed, "Live, laugh, love," in cheerful script. The irony was so bitter it made her laugh, a sound like breaking glass in the morning stillness. Live? She was barely surviving. Laugh. Every breath hurt. Love? She was beginning to wonder if she'd ever truly understood what the word meant. At sunrise, the door opened with an impatient jerk that suggested annoyance rather than concern. Beaufet stepped out, already pressing his phone to his ear, mid-argument about sales targets and quarterly projections. His business day was beginning with the same energy that had ended with her beating, as if violence was simply another item on his schedule. He glanced down at the crumpled figure on his doorstep, with the casual interest one might show for a discarded newspaper. No guilt shadowed his features. No concern softened his expression. She was simply an obstacle to navigate around, like debris after a storm. "You look wretched," he observed with clinical detachment. "Clean yourself before the neighbors wake up." He stepped over her carefully, his designer loafers avoiding the mud that had transferred from her body to his pristine welcome mat. The door slammed behind him with the finality of a tomb ceiling, leaving Scolola alone with the rising sun and the growing realization that she had exhausted every avenue of rescue. She remained on the mat for what felt like hours, her body too damaged and her spirit too broken to contemplate movement. The pink sky faded to ordinary blue while she watched, marking the transition from night's crisis to day's grim reality. A stray kitten wandered up during her vigil, its orange fur matted with the same rain that had soaked her to the bone. It approached cautiously, perhaps recognizing a fellow creature that had been abandoned by those who should have cared. "We are both unwanted, aren't we?" she whispered, stroking its damp fur with fingers that shook from cold and shock. The kitten purred against her palm, a small, stubborn proof that gentleness could still exist on the other side of cruelty. In that moment, the animal's unconditional acceptance meant more than all the conditional love she'd received from the humans in her life. Inside the duplex, the 15 windows caught the climbing sun, their panes gleaming like mirrors that reflected nothing but emptiness back at her. For Scolola, morning brought not the hope traditionally associated with sunrise, but the stark realization that escape would require more than courage or even desperation. It would require a miracle she had yet to imagine into existence. As she finally gathered the strength to rise from the welcome mat, Scolola made a silent vow to the stray kitten still purring against her leg. She would survive this, not because she was strong, but because even broken things deserved the chance to heal. Even discarded things retained their inherent value. Even orphans could learn to save themselves when no one else would. The door to her prison might be locked, but she was still breathing. And as long as she drew breath, the possibility of freedom remained alive, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. She just had to survive long enough to recognize that moment when it came. The beating had left more than physical scars. In the weeks that followed, Scolola discovered that trauma lived in her body like an unwelcome tenant, changing the way she moved through the world. Her ribs ached when she breathed too deeply. Her left eye twitched when sudden noises pierced the silence. Her hands trembled when preparing meals, as if they remembered the violence they'd witnessed and wanted to protect her from future harm. But the invisible wounds cut deeper than any bruise. The confident woman who'd once dreamed of literature and travel had been replaced by a ghost who flinched at shadows and spoke in whispers. She measured time not in days or weeks, but in the spaces between Beaufais's explosions, learning to read the atmospheric pressure of his moods with the desperate accuracy of someone whose survival depended on predicting storms. The receipt she'd found became both evidence and weapon, tucked away in her diary like a pressed flower marking the day her marriage revealed its true nature. She never confronted him about it again. The memory of his fists was education enough. Instead, she lived with the constant fear that his recklessness might cost her more than dignity. Every shared meal became a game of Russian roulette. Every night he reached for her became a calculation of risks she had no power to eliminate. She began taking long showers after he touched her, scrubbing her skin until it was raw, as if hot water and harsh soap could wash away the contamination of loveless intimacy. Beaufay, meanwhile, seemed to interpret her silence as acceptance. The beating had achieved its intended purpose: total submission through terror. He moved through the house with renewed confidence, his authority unchallenged, his word final. He'd successfully trained his wife to disappear whenever his convenience required it. "I'm having dinner with the Johnsons tomorrow," he announced one Thursday evening, not looking up from his phone. "Important clients. They'll be expecting to meet my wife." Sholola's heart lurched. After months of isolation, the prospect of human contact felt both thrilling and terrifying. She'd almost forgotten how to make conversation with people who weren't actively trying to diminish her existence. "What should I wear?" she asked carefully, the question itself a small act of hope. Beaufay's eyes swept over her with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating merchandise. "Something that doesn't embarrass me. And for God's sake, do something about your hair. You look like a market woman." The insult stung, but she'd learned to metabolize pain quickly to avoid prolonged exposure. Market women were hard-working, independent, successful in their own right. But she understood that in Beaufay's world, they represented everything he considered beneath his social status. She spent the next day preparing with the obsessive attention of someone trying to pass an exam, whose criteria kept changing. She borrowed makeup from the medicine cabinet, apparently left behind by previous women who'd occupied her space. She wrestled her natural hair into a sleek chignon that took 3 attempts and left her scalp aching from tight pulling. The dress she chose was conservative but elegant, a navy blue sheath that Chief Jide had purchased for church functions. It was one of the few items in her limited wardrobe that Beaufay hadn't specifically criticized, which made it the safest choice for public appearance. But when he saw her ready for departure, his expression soured like milk left in the sun. "That dress makes you look older," he said with casual cruelty. "And that hairstyle is too severe. You look like someone's governess." Sholola felt her carefully constructed confidence crumbling like sand castles before waves. She'd spent hours preparing, agonizing over every detail, and still she'd failed some impossible standard that seemed to shift whenever she approached it. "I can change," she offered desperately. "I have the green dress with—" "We don't have time," he snapped, already moving toward the door. "Try not to say anything stupid. These people are important." The dinner was held at a restaurant on Victoria Island, the kind of establishment where the waiters moved like ballet dancers, and the menu featured items that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. The Johnsons were a middle-aged British couple who'd moved to Lagos for Mr. Johnson's oil company position, and they greeted Beaufay with the warmth reserved for valuable business connections. "And this must be the lovely Mrs. Ogundipe," Mrs. Johnson said, extending a manicured hand toward Sholola with a smile that seemed genuine. "Beaufay has told us so much about you. Skolola wondered what version of herself Bofei had described, but she managed a smile that felt like stretching unused muscles. "Please, call me Skolola. It's wonderful to meet you." For the first hour, the evening proceeded with surprising normalcy. Mrs. Johnson asked polite questions about Skolola's background and interests, and Skolola found herself remembering how to engage in conversation that didn't involve defending her existence or apologizing for breathing. But as the wine flowed and business discussion intensified, Bofei's need to assert dominance began manifesting in increasingly subtle cruelties. When Skolola mentioned her interest in literature, he laughed dismissively. "My wife is quite the dreamer," he said to the table. "Always got her nose buried in some romantic nonsense. I keep telling her to focus on more practical matters." The dismissal was delivered with enough charm to sound like affectionate teasing, but Skolola felt its sharp edges cutting into her already fragile confidence. Mrs. Johnson's expression showed a flicker of discomfort, as if she'd recognized something unpleasant beneath the surface polish. When the waiter brought the wine list, Bofei ordered for the table without consulting anyone, including his wife. When Skolola tried to contribute to a conversation about Lagos culture, he cut her off mid-sentence to redirect attention to a business anecdote that positioned him as the hero of some commercial triumph. By the time dessert arrived, Skolola had retreated into the defensive silence that had become her default mode of survival. She smiled when expected, nodded at appropriate moments, and tried to become invisible enough to avoid further targeting. But Bofei wasn't finished asserting his power. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Johnson complimented Skolola's dress, calling it classic and elegant. Bofei's response was swift and devastating. "I keep trying to update her wardrobe," he said with practiced regret. "But she's quite attached to these older styles. Sentimental value, you understand." The implication was clear. His wife was behind the times, possibly due to inferior taste or limited resources. It was masterfully done, cruel enough to wound, but subtle enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. The drive home passed in silence, heavy enough to suffocate. Skolola stared out the window at Lagos nightlife. Young couples sharing laughter, friends embracing after evenings well spent, families walking together with the easy intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "You embarrassed me tonight," Bofei said finally, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated disappointment, sitting there like a mute. "What must they think of my wife?" Skolola wanted to ask what he expected from someone who'd been systematically silenced for months. But she'd learned that questions only invited more comprehensive punishment. Instead, she offered the response he wanted to hear. "I'm sorry. I'll do better next time." But even her apology irritated him. "That's your answer to everything. Sorry. Do you know how pathetic that sounds? How can I introduce you to important people when you act like a scared child?" The psychological whiplash was becoming familiar. Criticism for being too quiet, followed by punishment when she tried to speak. Condemnation for her responses, regardless of what those responses were. It was a game designed to be unwinnable, with rules that changed whenever she began to understand them. That night, as Bofei performed his ritual window locking with extra emphasis, Skolola lay in bed staring at the ceiling and counting the ways she'd become a stranger to herself. The woman who'd objected to her own wedding seemed like a character from someone else's story. The girl who'd dreamed of love and literature felt like a ghost haunting her memories. She was disappearing incrementally, like a photograph left in sunlight, and she wasn't sure enough of herself remained to mount any meaningful resistance. The diary entries were becoming shorter, more fragmented. as if even her inner voice was learning to whisper. July 15th, dinner with the Johnsons. I remembered how to smile. July 20th. He said I embarrass him. Maybe he's right. July 25th. What is the price of silence? Everything. For the first time, she'd written the answer, and seeing it on paper made something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, but something deeper. The recognition that she was complicit in her own erasure, that survival had taught her to collaborate with her own destruction. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt like the first honest moment she'd experienced in months, because awareness, even painful awareness, was better than the numbness that had been slowly consuming her. She was still trapped, still afraid, still alone, but she was no longer pretending that any of this was normal or acceptable or deserved. The price of silence was everything, but silence itself was a choice, and choices, she was beginning to remember, could be changed. The stray kitten had started visiting regularly, appearing at the kitchen window each morning, like a small orange reminder that affection could exist without conditions. Skolola had begun saving scraps for it, finding comfort in its unconditional presence. "You always come back," she whispered to it one morning as it purred against the glass, "even though no one takes care of you properly." The kitten's yellow eyes seemed to hold wisdom beyond its small frame, as if it understood that survival sometimes meant accepting whatever kindness was available, while continuing to search for something better. Perhaps, Skolola thought, that was a lesson worth learning. The call came on a rain-soaked Tuesday when the Lagos sky had turned the color of old bruises, and the air hung heavy with the promise of storms. Skolola was in the kitchen preparing pepper soup when her phone, an old device that Bofe barely tolerated her having, buzzed with Chief Jide's name on the screen. Her heart clenched automatically. Chief Jide never called without reason, and his reasons were always transactional. In the months since her marriage, their conversations had been limited to brief exchanges about business matters, each call a reminder that her value to him remained purely commercial. "Uncle," she answered, her voice carefully modulated to hide the exhaustion that had become her permanent state. "Skolola." His voice carried the brisk efficiency she remembered from childhood, every syllable calculated for maximum impact, with minimum emotional investment. "I trust you're well." It wasn't really a question. Chief Jide had never shown genuine interest in her well-being. It was a social courtesy, like asking about the weather without caring about the meteorological details. "Yes, sir. Thank you for asking." A pause filled with the sound of papers rustling, suggesting that even this conversation was happening simultaneously with more important business. "I've had some concerning reports about your marriage." Sholola's stomach dropped like an elevator with cut cables. Reports from whom? About what? Had someone witnessed her midnight flight to his house? Or was this about something else entirely? "I don't understand, sir," she managed, though her voice came out smaller than intended. "Chief Femi called me this morning. Apparently there's been some friction between you and Bofe. He's concerned about the stability of the arrangement." Arrangement. Not marriage, not relationship. Arrangement. The word stripped away any pretense that her feelings or happiness had ever been factors in this equation. She was a contract that was apparently underperforming, a merger that wasn't delivering expected returns. "What did he say?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be devastating. Chief Jide's sigh carried the weight of a man dealing with a malfunctioning asset. "He says you've been difficult, ungrateful, that you've been complaining about Bofe's business activities and making unreasonable demands." The words hit her like physical blows. Difficult, ungrateful, complaining. Each accusation was a masterpiece of distortion, transforming her desperate plea for basic safety into evidence of her own failure as a wife. "Uncle, that's not... I only asked him to use protection for both our health. I found medical receipts that suggested..." "Enough!" Chief Jide cut her off with the finality of a judge gaveling court to order. "A wife's role is to support her husband, not to police his activities. Men have needs, Skolola. Successful men especially. Your job is to make his home life comfortable, not to create additional stress." The casual dismissal of her health and safety felt like being erased in real time. Her concerns were being reframed as nagging. Her fear of disease was being rewritten as sexual jealousy. Her survival instincts were being repackaged as wifely defiance. "But, sir, I could become sick. You could become grateful," Chief Jide interrupted, his voice hardening into the tone he'd used throughout her childhood, whenever she'd shown the slightest hint of independent thought. "Do you know how many young women would give anything to be in your position, married to a successful man, living in luxury, freed from the burden of supporting yourself?" The luxury he referenced felt like gilded chains around her ankles. The success he celebrated came at the cost of her basic human dignity. The freedom he described was really just a different kind of captivity, more expensive but no less confining than the orphanage where she'd learned to swallow her voice. "Listen carefully," Chief Jide continued, and Skololo could hear him settling into his chair, preparing to deliver a lecture that would reshape her reality according to his convenience. "Marriage is not a fairy tale. It's a business partnership. Your contribution to this partnership is obedience, gratitude, and discretion. Beaufait's contribution is financial security and social status. What about love?" The question escaped before she could stop it, hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Chief Jide's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Love is a luxury for people who can afford it. Orphans cannot afford it. You had no options before this marriage, and you'll have fewer options if it fails. Do not test me on this, Sholola." The threat was implied but unmistakable. If she couldn't make this marriage work, if she couldn't learn to accept whatever treatment Beaufait chose to dispense, she would be completely alone. No safety net, no family support, no place to run when the next crisis arrived. "Now," Chief Jide continued, "Chief Femi is a reasonable man. He's willing to overlook this incident if you demonstrate immediate improvement, but he needs assurance that you understand your role and will fulfill it properly." "What kind of assurance?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "You will call him yourself. Today, you will apologize for your behavior and promise to be a better wife. You will thank him for his patience with your adjustment period." The words felt like poison in her throat. Apologize for asking to be protected from disease. Thank her father-in-law for tolerating her desire to survive her marriage. Promise to be better at accepting abuse. "I can't do that," she whispered. "Uncle, please. You don't understand what it's like here. He hurts me. He provides for you," Chief Jide snapped. "He puts a roof over your head and food in your stomach. Men of his caliber expect certain standards. If you cannot meet those standards, perhaps you're not mature enough for marriage. Not mature enough for marriage." As if maturity meant learning to smile while being poisoned, to say thank you while being beaten, to find gratitude in the very experiences that were killing her slowly from the inside. "Think carefully about your next words," Chief Jide warned, his voice dropping to the register he'd used when she was a child, testing the boundaries of his patience. "Your entire future depends on making this marriage work. I will not rescue you from consequences of your own ungrateful behavior." The line went dead, leaving Sholola alone with the dial tone's mechanical sympathy and the growing understanding that she had truly exhausted every potential source of help. Chief Jide, who'd raised her for 15 years, was choosing business profits over her safety. Chief Femi, who'd welcomed her into his family, was enabling his son's cruelty. Even the church community that had celebrated her wedding had disappeared now that the ceremony was over and the real work of survival had begun. She set the phone on the kitchen counter with hands that shook like autumn leaves, then sank onto a stool and stared at the pepper soup that had been simmering forgotten on the stove. The aroma should have been comforting. Rich palm oil, fresh fish, aromatic spices that spoke of home and care and nourishment. Instead, it smelled like obligation and fear. Another item on the endless list of ways she was expected to perform gratitude for her own captivity. The stray kitten appeared at the window as if summoned by her despair. Its orange fur bright against the gray afternoon. It pressed its small face against the glass. And for a moment, Sholola felt a connection to something that understood survival without requiring her to pretend it was anything other than difficult. "What do I do?" she whispered to the kitten, knowing it couldn't answer but needing to voice the question to someone who wouldn't judge her for asking. The kitten blinked slowly, its yellow eyes holding a wisdom that human beings seemed to have forgotten. That surviving didn't require gratitude for the circumstances that made survival necessary. That asking for basic safety wasn't ungrateful. That love, real love, didn't come with conditions that required the beloved to disappear. That evening, when Bofe returned from whatever business had kept him occupied, he found Sholola in the living room, hands folded in her lap like a penitent in church. She'd spent hours rehearsing what she needed to say, searching for words that might prevent the explosion she could feel building in the air between them. "Your father called my uncle," she said, before he could settle into his usual evening routine of finding fault with her existence. Bofe's expression shifted to something that might have been satisfaction, if it weren't quite so cold. "Good. It's time someone talked sense into you. He wants me to apologize to your father for asking you to use protection." The words felt like broken glass in her mouth, each syllable a small confession of defeat. But she watched Bofe's face carefully, hoping to see some flicker of recognition that the request was reasonable, that her fear was justified, that a husband who loved his wife wouldn't expose her to potentially life-threatening diseases. Instead, she saw validation, vindication, the satisfied expression of someone whose authority had been officially recognized by higher powers. "That's exactly what you should do," he said, loosening his tie with the casual confidence of someone whose worldview had just been validated by external authorities. "My father is a respectable man. He doesn't deserve to deal with a difficult daughter-in-law." Difficult. There was that word again, applied to any woman who had the audacity to want more than the minimum required to keep breathing. Sholola was learning that difficult meant having preferences, boundaries, hopes, or any sense of self-worth that might interfere with complete compliance. "Will you call him with me?" she asked, grasping for any small connection that might make the humiliation bearable. Bofe looked at her with something that might have been amusement if it had contained any warmth. "This is your mess to clean up. Handle it yourself." He disappeared upstairs, leaving her alone with the phone and the weight of another small death. Because apologizing for asking to be protected would kill something essential inside her. Some last remnant of the woman who'd once believed she deserved basic human dignity. But the alternative was complete abandonment. Chief Jide had made that clear. One phone call stood between her and absolute isolation, between marriage that was slowly killing her and homelessness that might kill her quickly. She dialed Chief Femi's number with fingers that felt disconnected from her body, each digit a step further away from any possibility of rescue. "Chief Femi, this is Skolola. I need to apologize." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours of carefully administered humiliation. She apologized for being ungrateful. She promised to be a better wife. She thanked him for his patience with her immaturity. Each word was a small funeral for the woman she'd once thought she might become. But when she hung up the phone, she was still alive, still breathing, still married to a man who was poisoning her slowly but surely. And in that moment, she realized that survival had taught her something important. Sometimes staying alive long enough to find real help required accepting temporary defeats that felt like total surrender. The stray kitten was still at the window, watching her with eyes that held no judgment, only recognition. They were both survivors in a world that didn't particularly care whether they lived or died, but they were both still here. And as long as they kept breathing, the possibility of something better remained alive, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The phone call was over, but the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The night that changed everything began like so many others, with the sound of Beaufait's key scraping against the lock, the heavy footsteps that announced his return, and the particular quality of silence that filled the house when a predator entered its territory. But this night carried a different energy, sharper and more dangerous than usual. Skolola had learned to read the atmospheric pressure of his moods with survival-dependent accuracy. And tonight, the air crackled with something that made her skin crawl with anticipation of violence. He'd been gone for 3 days, not unusual in itself, but the text messages had stopped coming after the first day. No business meetings running late, or staying in a bouja overnight. Just silence that stretched like a held breath until it became suffocating. Now he stood in the doorway of their bedroom at 2:17 a.m., swaying slightly with the loose-limbed instability of someone who'd been drinking for hours. But it wasn't just alcohol that made him dangerous tonight. It was something deeper, more primitive. The rage of a man who'd been challenged and was ready to reassert his dominance through any means necessary. "You," he said, pointing at her with the accuracy of someone whose reflexes remained sharp, despite his impairment. "Get up." Skolola had been lying awake for hours, as she always did when he was out late, her body refusing sleep until she knew whether she'd survive another night. Now she sat up slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might trigger an explosion. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Beaufait laughed, the sound sharp and brittle like breaking glass. "Everything's all right? Oh, that's rich. That's really rich." He began pacing the room with the restless energy of a caged animal, his designer shirt wrinkled and stained with what looked like wine and perfume that definitely wasn't hers. Each step was calculated to intimidate, each movement designed to remind her of his physical superiority. "Do you know what happened to me tonight?" he asked, stopping directly in front of her with enough force to make the floorboards creak. "Do you have any idea what your little tantrum cost me?" Sholola's mind raced through recent events, searching for whatever transgression he was referencing. The phone call to his father had been humiliating but successful. She'd apologized appropriately and promised to be better. She couldn't think of anything she'd done since then that might have caused problems. "I don't understand," she said carefully. "Of course you don't understand," he snarled, resuming his pacing with increased agitation. "You're too stupid to understand consequences, too selfish to think about anyone but yourself." He stopped at the window, one of the 15 that would soon be locked against her escape, and stared out at the Lagos night as if finding inspiration in the darkness. "I was at the club tonight," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture to a particularly dense student. "Important people were there. Business contacts, potential investors, people who matter." Skolola waited, understanding that her role in this conversation was to listen and absorb whatever blame he was preparing to assign her. "And do you know what happened? In the middle of a crucial conversation about expanding my father's shipping routes, someone brought up my marriage." The word marriage came out like a curse, dripping with disgust and resentment. Skolola felt her stomach clench with the familiar anticipation of pain. "Apparently," Boffe continued, turning back to face her with eyes that glittered with malicious satisfaction, "word has gotten around about your little complaint session, about how you questioned my authority, about how you embarrassed me in front of my own father." Sholola's mouth opened to protest, to explain that she'd only asked for basic safety, but Boffe cut her off with a gesture sharp enough to slice through her defense. Don't you dare try to explain yourself. I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses." He walked to the dresser and began removing his jewelry with the methodical precision of someone preparing for serious work. Gold watch, diamond cufflinks, wedding ring that had never meant anything beyond a business transaction. Marcus Johnson. You remember the Johnsons, don't you? The people you embarrassed me in front of at dinner. He was there tonight, and he had the nerve, the absolute nerve, to ask me if I was managing my domestic situation properly. Each word was pronounced with increasing venom, building toward an explosion that Skolola could feel gathering in the air like electrical charge before lightning. "Managing my domestic situation," Boffe repeated, his voice rising with each syllable. "As if I need to manage anything, as if there's anything wrong with how I handle my own wife." The last word exploded from his throat like a gunshot, and Skolola flinched involuntarily. She'd seen this rage before, but tonight it felt different, more focused, more personal, more dangerous. "And then," he continued, beginning to unbutton his shirt with movements that were becoming increasingly erratic, "then someone else mentioned that they'd heard rumors about trouble in the Ogundipo household. Can you imagine? The car ride through Lagos at 3 a.m. felt like traveling through a city of ghosts. Streetlights created pools of sickly yellow illumination that only made the darkness between them seem deeper, more threatening. Boffe drove with the casual confidence of someone familiar with conducting business in the shadows, his hands steady on the wheel despite the alcohol she could still smell on his breath. Skolola sat in the passenger seat, not because she was honored with that position, but because he wanted her to see where they were going, wanted her to understand each turn that took them further from civilization and closer to whatever ending he'd planned for her story. They left Victoria Island within minutes, crossing bridges that spanned water black as judgment in the pre-dawn darkness. The luxury high-rises and gated communities gave way to middle-class neighborhoods, then working-class areas, then sections of Lagos that most wealthy people pretended didn't exist. "Do you know where we're going?" Boffe asked conversationally, as if discussing dinner plans rather than what felt increasingly like an execution. Skolola didn't answer. Her throat had closed with terror. And even if she could speak, what response would satisfy a man who'd already decided she had no value? "We're going to Olusosun," he continued with the patient tone of a tour guide explaining local attractions. "Do you know what Olusosun is?" She did know, and the knowledge made her blood turn to ice. Olusosun was Lagos's largest dump site, a mountain of garbage and human waste, where the city's forgotten people scraped out survival by picking through refuse. It was where things went to disappear permanently, where bodies could be buried under tons of trash and never found. It's where garbage belongs, Beaufet said, confirming her worst fears. Where worthless things get disposed of properly. The car turned onto increasingly rough roads, potholes jarring them with each impact. Streetlights became sporadic, then disappeared altogether. The smell began reaching them even through the closed windows. A mixture of rotting organic matter, industrial waste, and human misery that seemed to seep through the metal and glass like liquid despair. "I want you to understand something," Beaufet said as they navigated the final approach to what she was increasingly certain would be her grave. "This isn't about anger anymore. This is about business. Business." Even her murder was being framed as a commercial transaction, a necessary cost of maintaining his reputation and market position. "You've become a liability," he continued with the dispassionate analysis of someone discussing quarterly reports. "The complaints, the questions about my authority, the whispers about problems in my household. It's all affecting my credibility. And credibility, in case you've forgotten, is everything in this business." They pulled through a gap in a chain-link fence that had been cut to allow unauthorized access. Beyond lay Olusosun in all its nightmarish glory. Mountains of trash stretching toward the horizon like a landscape from hell, fires burning in the distance where scavengers tried to stay warm. The silhouettes of people moving through the refuse like damned souls, searching for redemption. "This is what you are," Beaufet said, stopping the car at the edge of the dump and turning to look at her with eyes that held no trace of the man who'd once promised to love and protect her. "This is what you've always been. Trash. I just forgot for a while." He got out of the car and walked around to her side, opening the door with the courtesy of a doorman at a funeral home. "Come along. Let's finish this properly." Scolola's legs felt like water as she stepped onto ground that squelched with unidentifiable moisture. The smell hit her full force. Worse than anything she'd ever experienced. A combination of decay and chemicals and human waste that made her gag reflexively. But it was the sound that terrified her most. The rustling of unseen creatures moving through the garbage, the distant voices of scavengers working through the night, the mechanical noise of trucks dumping fresh loads of refuse onto the already towering piles. This was where people came to disappear, where families dumped relatives who'd become inconvenient, where powerful men disposed of problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. "Walk," Beaufet commanded, pushing her toward one of the larger piles of refuse, all the way to the top. Each step was treacherous, her bare feet finding purchase on surfaces that shifted and gave way without warning. Broken glass cut into her soles, sharp metal edges sliced through her wrapper, things she couldn't identify squished between her toes with textures that made her stomach revolt. But she climbed because the alternative was being dragged, and she wanted to maintain whatever dignity remained to her, even in these final moments. If she was going to die, she would do it on her feet, not crawling through garbage like the worthless creature he believed her to be. Halfway up the pile, Beaufet stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. "Here," he said with satisfaction. "This is perfect." They stood on a plateau of compressed refuse, old newspapers, discarded clothing, rotting food, electronic waste that leaked chemicals into the groundwater. In the distance, Lagos twinkled like a constellation of broken promises. The city that had never wanted her and was now ready to consume her entirely. "Look around," Beaufet instructed, gesturing toward the landscape of abandonment. "This is your kingdom. This is where orphans belong when they forget their place. But as Sholola looked around at the dump site, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling diminished by the comparison, she began to see something else entirely. Survival. Everywhere she looked, life was persisting despite impossible conditions. Plants growing through cracks in concrete. People finding value in things others had discarded. Communities forming among society's forgotten members. Even here, in this place of ultimate abandonment, human beings were refusing to disappear quietly. "Do you know what's going to happen now?" Beaufet asked, his voice carrying the patient authority of someone explaining inevitable consequences to a slow student. Sholola turned to face him, and for the first time in months, her voice emerged clear and strong. "You're going to leave me here to die." He smiled with genuine appreciation, like a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. "Very good. Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen." He reached into his pocket and pulled out her small bag, the one she'd brought to marriage with her few possessions, now apparently serving as her burial goods. "Your things," he said, dropping the bag at her feet with ceremonial gravity. "Everything you came with, everything you deserve." The bag hit the ground with a soft thud, its contents spilling slightly to reveal the pathetic collection of items that represented her entire material existence. A few worn clothes, her mother's jewelry box, the diary where she'd recorded her slow disappearance. "I'll drive back to Victoria Island," Beaufet continued with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing travel arrangements. "I'll tell anyone who asks that you left in the middle of the night. Ungrateful women do that sometimes. They abandon good husbands for reasons that make no sense to decent people." The story was already complete in his mind, her disappearance rewritten as abandonment rather than murder. She would become the ungrateful wife who'd thrown away a good marriage, not the victim of a man who'd literally thrown her away like garbage. "No one will look for you here," he added with cruel precision. "Chief Jide certainly won't. He's already written you off as a failed investment. And my father will be relieved that the family reputation is no longer threatened by your behavior." The systematic elimination of any possibility of rescue was thorough and devastating. She truly was alone in the most complete sense imaginable. "Any last words?" Beaufet asked with mock solemnity. Sholola looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful man he believed himself to be, but a scared child whose entire sense of self depended on his ability to control and diminish others, a person so empty inside that he could only feel powerful by making others feel powerless. "Yes," she said quietly, "I forgive you." The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His expression shifted from satisfaction to confusion, to something that might have been rage if it weren't so clearly rooted in fear. "What did you say?" "I forgive you," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "For all of it, the lies, the beatings, the humiliation. Even this, I forgive you, because holding on to hatred would only make me like you." For a moment, Beaufet looked genuinely shaken, as if forgiveness was a response he'd never considered and didn't know how to process. Then his face hardened back into the mask of cold authority. "Your forgiveness is worthless," he spat. "Just like everything else about you." He turned and began picking his way back down the garbage pile, moving with the careful precision of someone who wanted to avoid leaving evidence of his presence. At the bottom, he paused and looked back up at her one final time. "Goodbye, Sholola. Try not to make too much noise when you die. The scavengers don't like to be disturbed." The car engine started with a purr of expensive German engineering, headlights cutting through the darkness as Beaufet navigated his way back toward civilization. Sholola watched the lights disappear, marking the moment she officially became one of Lagos's disappeared. A person who'd simply stopped existing in any meaningful sense. She was alone on a mountain of garbage in the middle of the night, abandoned by her husband, disowned by her family, forgotten by everyone who'd ever claimed to care about her welfare. She had no money, no transportation, no way to contact help, even if help existed. But she was alive. Her heart was still beating. Her lungs were still drawing breath. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear voices, other human beings who'd somehow found ways to survive in this place of ultimate abandonment. Skolola picked up her bag and began walking deeper into the dump site, not because she had a destination in mind, but because movement felt better than surrender. Each step was an act of rebellion against the story Beaufet had written for her, a refusal to die quietly in the place he'd chosen for her grave. She didn't know what would happen next. She couldn't imagine how someone survived a night in Olusosun, much less built any kind of life from such complete devastation. But she was about to discover that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you becomes the first step toward the best thing you never dared to imagine. Because in the darkness ahead, headlights were approaching. Not Beaufet returning to finish what he'd started, but someone else entirely. Someone who would see treasure where others saw trash, value where others saw waste, potential where others saw only problems to be disposed of. The real story was just beginning. The headlights cutting through the darkness of Olusosun moved with a different rhythm than Beaufet's hasty retreat, where his car had fled the scene like something escaping contamination. These lights approached slowly, deliberately, with the measured pace of someone who belonged in this landscape of abandonment. Skolola crouched behind a pile of discarded electronics, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to become invisible. In her experience, men who drove expensive cars to dump sites in the middle of the night rarely brought good intentions. The possibility that this was an associate of Beaufet's, sent back to ensure she never left Olusosun alive, made her press deeper into the shadows. But as the vehicle drew closer, she could see it wasn't the predatory approach of someone hunting prey. The car moved with purpose but not aggression, its driver navigating the treacherous terrain with the familiarity of someone who had made this journey before. The black Lexus SUV stopped approximately 50 meters from where she hid, its engine purring with expensive restraint in the toxic air. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even in the dim light cast by the vehicle's headlamps, Skolola could see that this was not a man who belonged in garbage dumps. His white caftan was spotless, despite the surroundings, flowing around his tall frame like something celestial that had descended into hell. He moved with quiet confidence, but there was something careful about his posture, respectful even, as if he understood he was a guest in someone else's territory. He stood beside his car for several minutes, simply looking around, not with the disgust or fear that most wealthy Lagosians would show in such surroundings, but with something that looked almost like reverence, as if he saw value where others saw only waste. Then he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the night air, "Is anyone there? Anyone who needs help?" The question hung in the darkness like an offering. Skolola pressed herself deeper into hiding, every survival instinct screaming that this was too good to be true, that help didn't come to places like Olusosun, that men in expensive cars didn't drive through dump sites at 4 a.m. looking for people to rescue. But the man continued speaking, his voice steady and patient. "My name is Ameka Japan. I know this might seem impossible, but I'm here because someone needs help. I saw a car leaving this place, and something about it didn't feel right. Ameka, Japan. The name meant nothing to Sholola, but there was something in his tone, a quality of genuine concern that she hadn't heard in so long. She'd almost forgotten it existed, not the conditional kindness that came with expectations, but something that felt unconditional, offered freely without calculation of return. I don't know who you are or how you ended up here, he continued, taking a few steps forward, but not so many as to seem threatening. But I know that no one deserves to be left in a place like this. Whatever happened, whatever brought you here, you deserve better. The words hit Sholola like physical blows, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. After months of being told she deserved nothing, that she was worthless, that she belonged with garbage, hearing someone say she deserved better felt like being offered water after years in a desert. "Please," Ameka called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "If you're hurt, if you're afraid, I understand. But you don't have to stay here. You don't have to face this alone." Something in his tone, perhaps the way he said alone, as if he understood the weight of that word, made Sholola's resolve begin to crumble. She was alone, more completely than any human being should ever be. And this stranger was offering something she'd forgotten existed, the possibility that someone might help without requiring payment in submission or dignity. But it could be a trap. It probably was a trap. Men like Bofé had resources, connections, the ability to arrange elaborate deceptions to clean up their messes. This could be the final act in her murder, disguised as rescue to make her complicit in her own destruction. "I know you're scared," Ameka said, and somehow he was looking directly at her hiding place, as if he could see through the darkness and the debris to where she crouched in terror. "You have every right to be scared, but look at my hands." He raised both hands, palms open, fingers spread, a gesture of surrender that was visible even in the dim light. No weapons, no tricks, just someone who believes that every human being has value, even when the world has forgotten that truth. The phrase hit her like lightning. Even when the world has forgotten that truth. It was so precisely what she needed to hear, so exactly the validation her soul had been starving for, that it almost didn't matter if it was sincere. Just hearing someone say that human beings had inherent value felt like being given permission to exist. "My car is warm and safe," Ameka continued, still holding his hands visible. "I have water, food, blankets, medical supplies if you're hurt. No questions asked, no conditions attached. Just help, freely given. Because that's what human beings do for each other when we remember how. When we remember how." The phrase suggested that kindness was humanity's natural state, that cruelty was the aberration rather than the norm. After living for months in a world where every gesture came with strings attached, the idea of help without conditions felt revolutionary. Sholola found herself rising slowly from her hiding place, not because she'd made a conscious decision to trust this stranger, but because something deeper than rational thought was responding to his presence. She stood among the garbage and electronic waste, her faded wrapper clinging to her body like a shroud, and looked across the distance between them. When Ameka saw her, his reaction was immediate and devastating. His face crumpled with compassion so raw it was almost painful to witness. Not pity. Pity would have been condescending, diminishing. This was something else entirely. Recognition of shared humanity, acknowledgement of suffering, respect for survival. "Oh," he breathed, the single syllable carrying more genuine emotion than all of Bofé's words combined. "Oh, dear God, what did they do to you?" The question wasn't really directed at her. It was a prayer, an expression of outrage at the cruelty human beings could inflict on each other. And somehow that made it safe to approach, because he wasn't asking her to explain or justify or apologize for her condition. Skolola began walking toward him, each step a leap of faith that felt like jumping off a cliff. Her bare feet found purchase on surfaces that shifted and gave way. But she kept moving because the alternative was staying in hiding until she died of exposure or despair. As she drew closer, Emeka's expression shifted from compassion to something more complex. Not just sadness for her suffering, but anger at whoever had caused it. And somehow that anger, directed not at her but at her circumstances, felt protective rather than threatening. "You're hurt," he observed, when she was close enough for him to see the cuts on her feet, the bruises visible even in the dim light. "And you're freezing." Without waiting for permission, he opened the back door of his SUV and pulled out a blanket. Not expensive, but clean and warm. He approached her slowly, telegraphing his movements so she wouldn't be startled, and gently wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. The kindness of the gesture almost broke her completely. When had someone last touched her gently? When had anyone offered comfort without expecting something in return? The blanket smelled like lavender and safety, foreign concepts that her body remembered even when her mind had forgotten them. "My name is Emeka," he said softly, crouching down so they were at eye level rather than looking down at her. "What's your name?" The question was simple, but Skolola realized she'd almost forgotten the answer. She'd been wife for so long, that girl, and the orphan and ungrateful wretch, that her actual name felt like something from another lifetime. "Skolola," she whispered, and hearing herself say it felt like reclaiming something precious that had been stolen. "Skolola," Emeka repeated, pronouncing it with the care of someone handling something valuable. "That's a beautiful name. Thank you for trusting me with it. Thank you for trusting me." As if her name was a gift she'd chosen to give, rather than information extracted under duress. The reversal of power dynamics was so complete, it made her dizzy. "Can you tell me who brought you here?" he asked gently. "Not because I need to know, but because you deserve to have someone witness what happened to you." "Witness?" The word carried weight beyond its simple meaning. For months, Sholola's suffering had been invisible, denied, rewritten as something she deserved or had chosen. The idea that someone wanted to witness her truth, to acknowledge her experience as real and valid, was almost overwhelming. "My husband," she said, the words coming out in a whisper that carried the weight of months of silenced pain. Emeka's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Your husband brought you to a dump site and left you here?" When she nodded, unable to speak the fuller truth aloud, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the kind of heartbreak that comes from having your worst fears about human nature confirmed. "I'm so sorry," he said, and the apology carried no expectation that she forgive or forget or minimize what had happened. It was simply acknowledgement that she'd been wronged, that her suffering mattered, that she deserved better. "Would you like to come with me?" he asked. "I have a safe place, people who will help you heal. No pressure, no obligations, just safety while you figure out what comes next. Safety while you figure out what comes next. Not safety in exchange for compliance or gratitude or sexual availability. Just safety, freely given, while she reclaimed the ability to make her own choices about her own life." Skolola looked back at the mountain of garbage where Bofe had intended her to die, then at this stranger who was offering something she'd stopped believing existed. Kindness without conditions, help without strings attached, value recognized rather than purchased. "Yes," she said without hesitation. the word carrying more hope than she'd felt in years. "Yes, please," as Ameka helped her into the warm interior of his car, adjusting the seat so she'd be comfortable, offering her water and crackers from a small cooler. Xolola began to understand that her story wasn't ending in Olusosun. It was beginning again. The woman who'd been thrown away like garbage was about to discover that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you never dared to imagine. But first she had to learn how to believe she deserved good things. And Ameka Japan, she was beginning to realize, might be exactly the teacher she needed. The drive to Ameka's home felt like traveling between different planets. As they left the hellscape of Olusosun behind, Lagos began transforming around them, from wasteland to working-class neighborhoods to middle-class suburbs to something approaching paradise. Xolola sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in the borrowed blanket, her hands clutching a bottle of water that Ameka had pressed into her palms with the gentle insistence of someone who understood that dehydration could be as dangerous as physical wounds. She sipped it slowly, tasting cleanliness for the first time in what felt like years. "Are you warm enough?" Ameka asked, adjusting the car's climate control without taking his eyes off the road. "I can turn up the heat if you need it." The question was asked without expectation of gratitude or acknowledgement of his kindness. He was simply ensuring her comfort, because that's what decent human beings did for each other. A concept so foreign to Xolola's recent experience that it felt revolutionary. "I'm fine," she whispered, though fine was such an inadequate word for what she was feeling. She was alive when she should have been dead. She was warm when she should have been cold. She was safe when she should have been terrified. But fine seemed like the only response that wouldn't overwhelm the moment with the magnitude of her gratitude. "You don't have to be fine," Ameka said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "You don't have to be anything except whatever you are right now. There's no performance required here. No performance required." The phrase hit her like a revelation. For months, every moment of her existence had been a performance, playing the grateful wife, the submissive woman, the person who deserved whatever treatment she received. The idea that she could simply exist without acting was almost incomprehensible. They turned through ornate gates that opened as if by magic, revealing a driveway lined with royal palms and subtle lighting that made the approaching mansion look like something from a dream. The architecture was modern but warm, all clean lines and natural materials that seemed to grow organically from the landscape rather than imposing themselves upon it. "Welcome to my home," Ameka said, as they pulled up to the front entrance, where warm light spilled from floor to ceiling windows, and the sound of water features created an atmosphere of peace that felt almost sacred after the chaos of her recent life. Xolola stared at the house with something approaching disbelief. It was beautiful in a way that felt intentional. Rather, from trash to treasure, the Xolola story. Xolola woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window, and sunlight that felt different from any light she'd experienced in months. Warm without being harsh, bright without being blinding, gentle in a way that suggested safety rather than exposure. For a moment she lay still, afraid to move lest she disturb whatever magic had allowed her to sleep so deeply. The bed was soft beneath her body, the room quiet except for natural sounds that spoke of peace rather than threat. No footsteps approaching with angry intent. No doors slamming to announce displeasure. No locks clicking to remind her of her captivity. Just silence that felt protective rather than ominous. A gentle knock interrupted her reverie. "Xolola, dear." Mama Oge's voice carried the warm authority of someone who had spent decades caring for people. "Are you awake?" I have breakfast if you're hungry. Breakfast. Not demands or accusations or lists of failures, but simply food offered with kindness. Skolola sat up slowly, her body still remembering the reflexive fear that came with being summoned, even though every interaction in this house had been gentle. I'm awake, she called back, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Take your time, dear. I'll leave a tray outside your door. Eat when you're ready. The thoughtfulness of leaving food outside, rather than insisting on face-to-face interaction, showed an understanding of trauma that surprised Skolola. Someone had trained Mama Oge, or she'd learned through experience that healing people needed control over their environment, especially regarding when and how they interacted with others. When Skolola opened the door, she found a tray arranged with the kind of care usually reserved for special occasions. Fresh fruit, cut into perfect pieces, scrambled eggs that were still warm, toast with real butter, and tea that smelled like comfort and hope mixed together. But it was the small vase containing a single white rose that nearly undid her composure completely. Someone had taken time to make this meal beautiful, to add a touch of grace that served no functional purpose except to remind her that she deserved beauty in her life. She ate slowly, savoring not just the flavors but the experience of eating without fear. No one was timing her consumption or criticizing her table manners. No one was using mealtime as an opportunity to list her inadequacies. Food was simply nourishment, freely given, without conditions or expectations. After breakfast, she found clothes laid out on the chair, simple but well made, in colors that flattered rather than concealed her. The thoughtfulness extended to undergarments that fit properly, and shoes that were comfortable rather than performative. When she emerged from her room, she found Ameka in the garden, tending to plants with the patient attention of someone who understood that growth required time and care. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, his smile immediate and genuine. "Good morning," he said, setting down his watering can and approaching with the careful respect she was learning to recognize as his default manner. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted, the honesty feeling strange but liberating. "I'm glad." His relief seemed genuine, as if her well-being mattered to him for reasons beyond politeness or obligation. "Would you like to see the garden, or would you prefer to rest more?" The offer of choice, real choice, without hidden preferences or correct answers, was still novelty enough to make her pause. When had anyone last asked what she preferred, without having already decided what her answer should be? "I'd like to see the garden," she said, testing her voice's ability to express actual preferences. Ameka's garden was a masterpiece of thoughtful design, with native plants arranged to create spaces for both solitude and contemplation. There were benches positioned to catch morning sun, pathways that curved around water features, and secluded alcoves where someone could sit with a book or simply think. "I find gardening therapeutic," Ameka explained as they walked. "There's something about helping things grow that reminds me what life is supposed to be about." What life is supposed to be about. Skolola realized she'd almost forgotten that life was supposed to be about growth and beauty and peace. For months, life had been about survival and fear and making herself small enough to avoid punishment. "What is it supposed to be about?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Ameka paused beside a fountain where water danced over smooth stones, its sound creating a natural symphony that seemed to ease tension from the air itself. "Connection," he said thoughtfully. "Growth. Contributing something positive to the world. Finding joy in small moments. Treating other people as if they matter. Because they do. Treating other people as if they matter." Such a simple concept. But Skolola realized it had been absent from her life for so long, she'd almost forgotten it was possible. They spent the morning walking through different sections of the garden, Ameka pointing out plants he particularly loved and explaining the stories behind various design choices. He spoke with passion, but without dominating the conversation, leaving space for her questions and observations. "This area is for vegetables," he said, gesturing toward raised beds filled with tomatoes and peppers and leafy greens. "Mama Oge insists on growing our own food when possible. She says it tastes better when you've tended it yourself." "She's right," Sholola said, remembering childhood afternoons helping her mother in their small garden before the accident that had changed everything. "My mother used to grow vegetables. I loved helping her." The memory emerged without the usual accompanying pain, perhaps because she was sharing it with someone who seemed to value, rather than dismiss, her experiences. "What was she like?" Ameka asked gently. Sholola found herself talking about her parents for the first time in years. Not the idealized versions that people wanted to hear about, but the real human beings they'd been. Her mother's laugh that could fill a room, her father's habit of singing while he worked, the way they'd treated each other with affection and respect that had seemed normal until she'd experienced its absence. "They sound wonderful," Ameka said when she finished. "You carry their love with you, you know. That's not something anyone can take away. You carry their love with you." The phrase hit her like revelation, suggesting that her parents' legacy wasn't just loss and abandonment, but also the capacity for love they'd nurtured in her, that their death hadn't erased their influence, just changed how it manifested. "I'd forgotten that," she admitted. "Trauma has a way of making us forget our own strength," Ameka said with the wisdom of someone who'd either experienced or witnessed significant pain. "But strength doesn't disappear just because we can't feel it temporarily." They had lunch on the terrace, a simple meal that felt luxurious because it was eaten in peace. Mama Oge joined them, her conversation flowing easily between questions about Sholola's comfort and stories about the household's daily rhythms. "Sir Ameka rescued a family of stray cats last month," Mama Oge reported with the affectionate exasperation of someone who'd learned to expect such behavior. "They're living in the garden shed now. He says temporary arrangements have a way of becoming permanent when they involve creatures who need care." Ameka's slight flush suggested this was a recurring theme, that his tendency to help strays, both human and animal, was well-established household knowledge. They needed somewhere safe, he said with the mild defensiveness of someone whose compassion regularly exceeded his practical judgment. "And the shed was just sitting empty. The cats? Or the people?" Mama Oge asked with a knowing look. "Both," Ameka admitted with a laugh that suggested he'd long ago accepted his reputation as someone who couldn't turn away from suffering. Skolola found herself smiling. Actually, smiling. Not the performative expression she had learned to wear, but genuine amusement at the gentle teasing between two people who clearly cared about each other. "Can I see the cats?" she asked, surprising herself with the spontaneous request. "Of course," Ameka said, rising immediately to lead her toward the garden shed. "But I should warn you, they're quite charming. You might find yourself wanting to adopt them all." The cats were indeed charming. A mother with 3 half-grown kittens who'd clearly decided that Ameka's garden shed was paradise. They approached Skolola with the careful curiosity of creatures who'd learned to assess human intentions before committing to interaction. They were living behind a restaurant, Ameka explained as one of the kittens began investigating Skolola's shoelaces. The owner wanted them gone, but they had nowhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. Skolola understood that feeling intimately, the desperation of needing shelter and finding only rejection. She knelt down and extended her hand toward the mother cat, letting the animal decide whether contact was welcome. The cat approached slowly, sniffed her fingers, then began purring with the volume of a small engine. The sound vibrated through Sholola's palm and up her arm, a physical reminder that affection could exist without conditions or expectations. "She likes you," Ameka observed with satisfaction. "How can you tell? She is not purring because she has to," he said with gentle humor. "She's purring because she wants to. That's the difference between real affection and performed gratitude." Real affection versus performed gratitude. Sholola realized she'd almost forgotten the difference. Had spent so many months performing emotions, she didn't feel that authentic feelings had begun to seem foreign. But here, with a cat purring in response to simple kindness, she remembered what genuine connection felt like. No agenda, no calculation, just two living creatures acknowledging each other's worth. That evening, as they sat in the living room after dinner, Ameka asked the question she'd been dreading. "Do you want to talk about what happened to you?" The invitation was gentle but direct, offering her the choice to share or remain silent, without making either option feel wrong. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. "Wherever feels right," Ameka said simply. "Or not at all, if that feels better." The absence of pressure made sharing feel possible rather than mandatory. Slowly, hesitantly, Sholola began telling her story, not the version that minimized or excused or blamed herself, but the truth about what marriage had become for her. Ameka listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as the scope of her husband's cruelty became clear. But he didn't offer solutions or advice or judgments about what she should have done differently. He simply witnessed her truth with the respect it deserved. "I'm sorry," he said when she finished. "No one should ever have to endure that. None of it was your fault. None of it was your fault." The absolution she'd needed to hear but had never expected to receive. Permission to stop carrying responsibility for someone else's choices to be cruel. "What happens now?" she asked, voicing the question that had been building all day. "Now we focus on helping you heal," Ameka said with quiet certainty. "Everything else can wait until you're ready to decide what you want your life to look like. Until you're ready to decide what you want your life to look like. Not what others expected or demanded or required, but what she actually wanted for herself." For the first time in years, Sholola began to believe that might be possible. Days in Ameka's house began to follow a rhythm that felt more like living than surviving. Sholola woke naturally rather than to alarms or demands. She ate when hungry rather than according to someone else's schedule. She spent time in the garden, helping with simple tasks that made her feel useful without being exploited. Most importantly, she began to remember who she was beneath the layers of fear and compliance that marriage had accumulated around her like scar tissue. "I used to love reading," she told Mama Oge one morning as they worked together in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for lunch. Before everything changed." "What kind of books?" Mama Oge asked, her question carrying genuine interest rather than polite inquiry. "Poetry, mostly. Nigerian writers like Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka, but also international authors. I wanted to understand how people in different places thought about love and loss and hope. Sir Ameka has an extensive library," Mama Oge said with a knowing smile. "I'm sure he'd be happy to show you. He's always looking for someone to discuss books with." The idea of having literary conversations again, of engaging with ideas that didn't center on domestic management or wifely obligations, felt like remembering a language she'd thought was lost forever. That afternoon, Ameka found her sitting in the garden with one of the rescued cats curled in her lap, both of them enjoying the peaceful silence. "Mama Oge mentioned you enjoy reading," he said, settling onto the bench beside her with respectful distance. "Would you like to see the library?" Sholola's heart leaped at the offer, but habit made her hesitate. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose, Skolola," Ameka said gently. "You're not imposing by having interests. You're not taking up too much space by existing fully. The library is there to be used. You're not taking up too much space by existing fully." The permission was so direct and necessary that it almost brought tears to her eyes. She'd spent months learning to minimize herself, to disappear into the background of her own life. The library was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books in multiple languages, comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch natural light, and the kind of peaceful atmosphere that suggested knowledge was valued and protected here. "Take anything that interests you," Ameka said, running his fingers along the spines with obvious affection. "Books are meant to be read, not displayed." Skolola found herself gravitating toward the poetry section, her fingers touching volumes by authors she remembered loving, and others she'd never had the chance to discover. When she pulled out a collection by Maya Angelou, Ameka's face lit up with recognition. "That's one of my favorites," he said with enthusiasm. "Have you read Still I Rise?" They spent the next hour discussing poetry, their conversation flowing with the ease of two people who shared genuine intellectual passion. Ameka's knowledge was extensive but worn lightly. He asked thoughtful questions about her interpretations, rather than lecturing about his own opinions. "I'd forgotten how good this feels," Skolola admitted as they prepared to leave the library. "Having conversations about ideas instead of other things." "What kinds of conversations were you having?" Ameka asked carefully. Skolola considered the question seriously. "Instructions, mostly. About cooking or cleaning or how to behave in public. Criticism about things I'd done wrong. Explanations of why I should be grateful for things that didn't feel like gifts." The summary of her recent conversational life sounded even more depressing when spoken aloud, reducing months of interaction to their essential emptiness. "That's not conversation," Ameka said with quiet indignation. "That's conditioning. You deserve dialogue, not monologue disguised as communication. You deserve dialogue." Another revolutionary concept in her expanding understanding of what relationships could be. Mutual exchanges rather than unidirectional lectures. That evening, as had become their custom, they sat in the living room after dinner. But tonight, instead of simply sharing comfortable silence, Skolola found herself asking questions that had been building since her arrival. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "I mean, really? You don't know me. I could be anyone, dangerous or crazy or someone who deserved better than being abandoned in a garbage dump," Ameka finished for her. "Which you are. But how did you know? How could you be sure that I hadn't done something to deserve?" She couldn't finish the sentence, partly because the words felt like poison in her mouth, and partly because she realized she was still, somewhere deep inside, wondering if maybe Bofei had been right about her worthlessness. Ameka was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Can I tell you something about myself?" he asked finally. Skolola nodded, grateful for the shift away from her own doubts. "I wasn't always successful," Ameka began, settling back in his chair with the manner of someone preparing to share something significant. "I grew up poor, really poor. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families, and sometimes she'd take me with her because she couldn't afford childcare." He paused, his eyes focusing on something in the distance as if seeing his past played out before him. "I remember watching how these families treated my mother. Not cruelly, exactly, but as if she were invisible unless they needed something, as if her humanity only mattered when it served their convenience." Skolola felt a chill of recognition. She understood that particular form of invisibility intimately. When I was 8, my mother got sick, Emeka continued. Really sick. And the family she'd worked for the longest, the ones who called her part of the family when it was convenient, they fired her, said they couldn't risk the liability of having someone unreliable on staff. I'm sorry, Sholola whispered. She died 2 months later, Emeka said simply, and I made myself a promise that if I ever had the power to help people who were being treated as disposable, I would, because everyone deserves better than that. The story explains so much about his immediate response to finding her in Olusosun, his instinctive understanding of what abandonment felt like, his careful attention to treating her with dignity rather than condescension. I didn't help you because you deserved it more than anyone else, he continued. I helped you because you're human, and humans help each other. That's how we're supposed to work. Humans help each other. Such a simple principle, but one that felt revolutionary after months of living in a world where help came with prices she couldn't afford to pay. What if I can never repay you? She asked, voicing the fear that had been growing alongside her gratitude. Emeka looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Repay me for what? For this? For everything? The room, the food, the kindness? What if I can never give you something equivalent? Skolola, Emeka said with gentle certainty. Kindness isn't a loan. It's not an investment expecting returns. It's just what decent people do when they encounter suffering they can alleviate. Kindness isn't a loan. The concept was so foreign to her recent experience that it took several moments to process. Every kindness in her marriage had come with interest rates. Every gesture of care had been an investment in future compliance. But surely you must want something, she pressed, unable to fully believe in completely unconditional help. Emeka was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. I want you to heal, he said finally. I want you to remember that you have value that doesn't depend on what you can do for other people. I want you to believe that you deserve happiness, not because you've earned it, but because you're alive. Because you're alive. As if existence itself was sufficient justification for kindness, respect, and care. I don't know how to do that, Shololo admitted. I don't know how to believe I deserve good things just for being myself. That's okay, Emeka said with infinite patience. Healing isn't something you figure out all at once. It's something you practice, day by day, until it becomes natural again. Until it becomes natural again. The phrase suggested that her current self-doubt wasn't permanent, that the woman who'd once believed in her own worth still existed beneath the layers of trauma and conditioning. Will you help me practice? She asked, the question emerging with vulnerability that felt both terrifying and necessary. For as long as you need, Emeka promised, and even after you don't need it anymore, if you want. That night, Sholola lay in bed reading Maya Angelou by lamplight, letting the poet's words wash over her like healing rain. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. She wasn't sure she believed it yet, that she could choose not to be reduced by what had happened to her. But for the first time in months, she was beginning to think it might be possible. The woman she'd been before marriage hadn't completely disappeared. She was just buried under layers of fear and compliance, waiting for permission to emerge again. And in Emeka's house, surrounded by kindness that asked for nothing in return, that permission was finally being granted. She fell asleep with the book still open in her hands, dreaming not of garbage dumps and locked windows, but of libraries and gardens and cats who purred simply because they were content. The healing had truly begun. 3 weeks into her stay, Sholola made her first independent decision in months. She asked Emeka if she could help with his business. The request surprised her. as much as it seemed to surprise him. They were having breakfast on the terrace, watching the morning sun paint the garden in shades of gold and green, when the words emerged from some part of herself that was remembering what purpose felt like. "I studied business administration," she said, her voice tentative but growing stronger with each word. Before the marriage, I was good with numbers, with organization. I know I'm out of practice, but I thought maybe—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Was she overstepping, presuming too much, reading signals that weren't there? But Emeka's face lit up with something that looked like genuine excitement. "That would be wonderful," he said immediately. "I've been drowning in paperwork, and my current assistant just gave notice. But are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility? Ready for responsibility?" After months of being treated as incapable of managing basic decisions, the idea of being trusted with meaningful work felt both thrilling and terrifying. "I think so," she said, testing her own conviction. "I'd like to try." "Then we'll start small," Emeka said, with the kind of practical kindness she was learning to associate with him. "See how it feels. No pressure if it doesn't work out." Emeka's business, she discovered, was more complex and far-reaching than she'd initially understood. He owned shipping companies, real estate developments, and import-export operations that stretched across West Africa. But what surprised her most was the ethical framework that seemed to guide every decision. "We don't just maximize profit," he explained as he showed her through his home office, a space that managed to be both professional and welcoming. "We try to create value for everyone involved, employees, customers, communities, everyone involved." Such a different philosophy from the businesses she'd observed through Chief Jide and Beaufay, where success was measured purely in terms of what could be extracted from others. "What does that look like practically?" she asked, genuinely curious about how such principles translated into daily operations. Fair wages, environmentally responsible practices, investment in local communities rather than just extraction from them. It's more complicated than pure profit maximization, but it's also more sustainable. Emeka handed her a stack of financial reports, then paused, studying her expression carefully. "You don't have to agree with our approach," he said. "I'm interested in your honest assessment, not just confirmation of what I want to hear. Your honest assessment." When had anyone last asked for her genuine opinion rather than the response they preferred to receive? Sholola spent the next several hours immersed in numbers and projections, her mind engaging with analytical challenges it had been starved of for months. The work felt like stretching muscles that had been cramped too long, painful at first, but increasingly satisfying as circulation returned. By late afternoon, she had several observations and suggestions that felt substantive rather than superficial, but as she prepared to share them, familiar anxiety crept in. What if her ideas were stupid? What if she'd misunderstood something fundamental? What if her months of intellectual dormancy had left her unable to think clearly? "What did you find?" Emeka asked, settling into the chair across from his desk, with the same respectful attention he gave everything she said. Skolola took a deep breath and began presenting her analysis, her voice growing steadier as she moved through her findings. She'd identified several areas where efficiency could be improved without compromising ethical standards, and she had questions about expansion opportunities that might benefit local suppliers. When she finished, Emeka was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "These are excellent observations," he said finally. "Particularly your suggestion about the supplier network. I hadn't considered that approach. Excellent observations. Not good for someone out of practice, or impressive considering. But genuinely excellent. The validation felt like sunlight after months of shadows. "You really think so?" she asked, unable to completely suppress the need for reassurance that months of criticism had embedded in her psyche. "I think so," Ameka said with quiet conviction. "And more importantly, you should trust your own judgment. Your analysis is sound, your suggestions are practical, and your insights are valuable. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The phrase felt like armor against the voices in her head that still whispered Beaufait's criticisms, still questioned her right to have opinions or make suggestions. Over the following weeks, Sholola's role in the... And then, he continued, beginning to unbutton his shirt, with movements that were becoming increasingly erratic, then someone else mentioned that they'd heard rumors about trouble in the Ogundipo household. Can you imagine? People talking about my private business because my wife can't keep her mouth shut. Sholola wanted to point out that she'd barely spoken to anyone outside the house in months, that she had no friends to confide in, and no family who cared enough to listen. But she'd learned that logic was useless when Beaufait was in this state, that facts only provided more ammunition for his rage. "Do you know what that does to a man's reputation?" he asked, approaching the bed with the slow, deliberate steps of a predator stalking wounded prey. "Do you have any concept of how business works in this country? Trust is everything. Respect is everything. And you pathetic, ungrateful orphan, you've been undermining both." He sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath, mixed with perfume that belonged to other women. His proximity made her skin crawl. But moving away would only escalate his anger. "I built my reputation over years," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. "Years of careful networking, strategic relationships, calculated investments in the right people. And you're destroying it with your selfishness." Sholola found her voice, small and trembling but still present. "I never told anyone anything. I only talked to your father because..." The slap came without warning, sharp and precise, splitting her lip with surgical accuracy. The taste of copper flooded her mouth immediately. But it was the cold calculation in his eyes that terrified her most. "Because you're stupid," he finished for her. "Because you don't understand that everything you do reflects on me. Every word you speak, every expression on your face, every moment of dissatisfaction you show, it all comes back to me." He stood and resumed pacing, his movements becoming more agitated with each step. "Tonight I had to stand there and listen to grown men questioning my ability to control my own household. Do you know how humiliating that is? Do you have any idea what that does to future business prospects?" Sholola realized with growing horror that this wasn't about her health or safety or even her behavior. This was about his ego, his image, his standing among men who measured worth by the degree of dominance they exercised over the women in their lives. "I should have known better than to marry beneath my station," he continued, the words falling like hammer blows on her already shattered sense of self-worth. "My father warned me that charity cases always come with complications, that gratitude has a shelf life. Charity case." The phrase transformed her entire existence into an act of benevolence on his part, rewriting their marriage as his generous gift to a woman who should have been grateful for any attention at all. "But I thought," he said, stopping directly in front of her again, "that even an orphan could learn proper behavior with enough guidance. I thought wrong." He walked to the dresser and opened the bottom drawer, the one she'd never been allowed to look inside. When he turned back, he was holding something that made her blood turn to ice water. Her passport. "You want to embarrass me?" he asked, holding the document like evidence in a trial. "You want to make me look like a man who can't control his own wife? Fine. Let's see how well you do without my protection." The threat was clear without being spoken. He was considering throwing her out, not divorce. That would require legal proceedings and public acknowledgement of failure. Just abandonment, discarding her like furniture that had outlived its usefulness. "Buffet, please," she whispered, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "I never meant to embarrass you. I just wanted us to be safe." "Safe," he repeated, pronouncing the word like a profanity. "You want to talk about safety? Let me tell you about safety, little orphan girl." He sat back down on the bed, this time close enough that his leg pressed against hers with uncomfortable intimacy. "Safety is having a husband who provides for you. Safety is having a roof over your head and food in your stomach. Safety is being married to a man with connections, with power, with the ability to protect you from a world that would eat you alive if you were on your own." Each word was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. But underneath the condescension was a threat as sharp as any blade. "You seem to have forgotten that without me, you're nothing," he continued. "No family worth mentioning, no money, no skills that anyone would pay for, no beauty to speak of, nothing that would make any man want to take care of you." The systematic destruction of her self-worth was masterful in its cruelty. Each statement contained just enough truth to make it devastating while ignoring every quality that might contradict his narrative. "So when you complain about my behavior," he said, leaning closer until his breath was hot against her ear, "when you question my decisions or make demands about my personal life, you're not being brave. You're being suicidal." The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Suicidal. As if asking for basic human dignity was tantamount to self-destruction. "Now," Buffet said, standing and walking back to the dresser, "we're going to settle this once and for all. You're going to learn your place, and you're going to stay in it." He opened another drawer and pulled out a small velvet box that Sholola had never seen before. When he opened it, her heart stopped. Inside was a key, ornate and golden, like something from a fairy tale turned nightmare. "This," he said, holding up the key with ceremonial gravity, "is the key to your room, her room. Not their room, not the master bedroom where she'd been sleeping for months, but her room, as if she were about to be relocated from wife to prisoner. From now on," he continued, "you'll sleep in the guest room. You'll take your meals there unless I specifically invite you to join me. You'll have 1 hour each morning to clean the common areas, and the rest of your time will be spent in reflection on how to be a better wife." The pronouncement was delivered with the authority of a judge passing sentence, each condition designed to isolate her further from any possibility of normal human interaction. "And," he added, his voice taking on a note of satisfaction that made her skin crawl, "you'll wear this." From the same drawer he produced a thin gold chain with a small pendant. Not jewelry, but something else entirely. As he held it up to the light, Sholola realized with growing horror that it was a tracking device, disguised as an expensive accessory. "This way," Buffet explained with the patience of someone describing a particularly clever business strategy, "I'll always know where you are. No more midnight runs to Uncle's house. No more embarrassing scenes in public. No more pretending you have options you don't actually have." The electronic leash represented the final step in her transformation from wife to property, from human being to possession that needed to be monitored and controlled. "Put it on," he commanded, extending the chain toward her with expectant authority. Sholola stared at the device, understanding that accepting it would mean accepting her complete subjugation, that wearing it would transform her from a woman who'd been abused into a woman who'd agreed to be owned. "No," she said, the word emerging from somewhere deep inside her that she'd thought had been silenced forever. Beaufais's expression shifted from satisfaction to surprise to something much more dangerous. "What did you say?" "No," she repeated, her voice gaining strength with repetition. "I won't wear it." The silence that followed was heavy enough to collapse buildings. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of her refusal hanging between them like a challenge to the natural order of their universe. Then Beaufais smiled, and Sholola knew she was about to pay dearly for rediscovering her voice. "You know what?" he said, his tone conversational and therefore infinitely more terrifying than his previous rage. "You're right. You won't wear it." He walked to the window and stood looking out at the Lagos night, his silhouette dark against the glass. "Because you won't be here to wear it?" When he turned back to face her, his expression had shifted into something cold and final, like a businessman who'd just decided to terminate an underperforming contract. "Get dressed," he said with matter-of-fact authority. "We're going for a drive." The command sent ice through Sholola's veins. Nothing good happened when angry men took defenseless women for drives in the middle of the night. She'd heard stories, whispered conversations in the orphanage about girls who'd disappeared, about bodies found in lagoons, about women who'd defied powerful men and simply vanished. "Where are we going?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Beaufais's smile widened, but it held no warmth, no humanity, no mercy. "Somewhere you'll finally understand your true worth." He threw her a wrapper, not one of the better ones, but a faded Ankara cloth that had seen better days, and stood waiting with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world to destroy another human being. "Get dressed," he repeated, "unless you'd prefer to go naked. I'm sure the rats won't mind." Rats. The word confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. He was taking her somewhere unspeakable, somewhere that would serve as the final lesson in what happened to women who forgot their place in his world. With trembling hands, Sholola wrapped the cloth around herself, each movement feeling like preparation for her own funeral. But even as terror threatened to paralyze her completely, something else was awakening inside her. Not hope, exactly, but a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. If this was the end, she would at least face it as herself, not as the broken creature he'd spent months trying to create. She would remember her name, her worth, her right to exist, even if no one else would defend those rights. The door to her prison was about to open, but not in the way she'd ever imagined. Sometimes freedom came disguised as the worst thing that could happen, and sometimes survival required walking voluntarily into the darkness. Beaufais was already heading toward the stairs, car keys jingling in his hand like wind chimes announcing a storm. "Come along, dear wife," he called over his shoulder, his voice carrying mock affection that made her stomach turn. "It's time for your final lesson in gratitude." Sholola followed him into the night, her bare feet silent on the marble stairs, her heart pounding with the rhythm of someone walking toward either death or transformation. She had no way of knowing which it would be, but she was still breathing, and as long as she drew breath, the possibility of survival remained alive, even if that survival came from the most unexpected source imaginable. Spring in Lagos brought new life to Emeka's garden, and with it, a shift in the household's rhythm that everyone could feel but no one initially acknowledged. Sholola had been living with them for 4 months now, her presence having evolved from temporary refuge to integral part of their daily life. She woke each morning with purpose, diving into business projects that challenged her mind and contributed meaningfully to Emeka's various enterprises. Her suggestions had improved efficiency across multiple operations, and her insights into market analysis had helped identify several profitable opportunities that might otherwise have been missed. But it wasn't just professional competence that was flourishing. Skolola was becoming herself in ways that surprised everyone, including her. She sang while working in the kitchen, her voice carrying melodies from childhood that had been silent for years. She debated politics and literature with passion, her opinions formed through genuine thought rather than calculated to please. She laughed easily and often, finding humor in daily situations that would once have been colored by anxiety. Most remarkably, she was beginning to dream again. Not the nightmares that had plagued her early weeks of recovery, but actual dreams about possibilities and futures that felt attainable rather than fantastical. "I've been thinking about starting a foundation," she told Emeka one evening as they sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope, "for women who need safe places to land when their lives fall apart." The idea had been growing in her mind for weeks. Nurtured by her own experience of rescue and recovery, she'd begun to understand that her story, while painful, might contain wisdom that could help others navigate similar darkness. "Tell me more," Emeka said, his attention focusing with the intensity he brought to anything that mattered to her. "I keep thinking about all the women who don't have what I have," Skolola said, her voice gaining strength as she articulated thoughts that had been forming slowly but surely. "Who don't have someone like you to find them in their worst moments, who are trapped in situations they can't escape because they have nowhere else to go." Emeka nodded, his expression thoughtful. "What would the foundation provide?" "Everything I needed but couldn't find," she said without hesitation. "Safe housing, emotional support, job training, legal assistance. But most importantly, the understanding that they have value, regardless of what's been done to them or what they've had to do to survive. They have value regardless." The principle that had been the foundation of her own healing, now forming the cornerstone of her vision for helping others. "It's a powerful idea," Emeka said carefully, "but it would be emotionally demanding work. Are you sure you're ready for that?" The question wasn't dismissive, but genuinely concerned for her well-being. After months of careful rebuilding, was she strong enough to immerse herself in others' trauma without destabilizing her own recovery? "I think I need to do it," Skolola said, testing her conviction as she spoke. "Not because I'm completely healed. I don't know if anyone ever is completely. But because I understand something about survival that might help other people find their way through. Something about survival. The hard-won wisdom that came from having been broken and choosing to rebuild rather than remain shattered. Then we'll make it happen, Emeka said, with the quiet determination she'd learned to recognize as his response to worthwhile challenges. We? She asked, surprised by the automatic inclusion. If you want my help, he clarified quickly. I don't want to assume or impose, but I'd be honored to support this work if you think I could be useful. If you want my help. Even now, after months of kindness and partnership, he was careful to respect her autonomy, to avoid presuming her consent to his involvement. I'd love your help, she said, the admission feeling both natural and revolutionary. When had she last wanted someone's help, rather than fearing it would come with unacceptable conditions? As they began planning the foundation over the following weeks, Skolola discovered that working towards something larger than herself was completing her healing in ways that pure recovery never could. Having a mission that mattered gave weight to her survival, purpose to her pain, meaning to the worst experiences of her life. But it also brought them closer together in ways that began to feel significant beyond partnership or friendship. They spent long hours discussing logistics and philosophy, their conversations flowing with the ease of two minds that complemented each other naturally. They worked late into the evening, sharing ideas and building dreams with the collaborative energy of people who shared fundamental values. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the nature of their connection began to shift. What had started as caregiver and patient, then evolved into employer and employee, was becoming something else entirely. Something that felt like partnership in the fullest sense of the word. Sholola began noticing things about Emeka that had nothing to do with his kindness or generosity. The way he listened with his whole body when someone was speaking. The careful attention he paid to ensuring everyone around him felt valued and heard. The quiet strength that allowed him to help others without needing recognition or reward. But it was more than admiration for his character. She found herself aware of his physical presence in ways that had nothing to do with safety or comfort. The way he moved through space, with unconscious grace. The sound of his laughter when something genuinely amused him. The feeling of peace that settled over her when he was nearby. The realization that she was falling in love with him hit like lightning on a clear day. Sudden, powerful, and impossible to ignore. The recognition terrified her. Not because Emeka was dangerous. Every interaction had proved his gentleness and respect. But because love felt like too much to risk after everything she'd endured. What if these feelings were gratitude disguised as attraction? What if her judgment was still compromised by trauma? What if the safety she'd found with him was too precious to risk by introducing romantic complications? But as weeks passed and the feelings only grew stronger, she began to understand that this wasn't desperation or dependency disguised as love. This was genuine recognition of a person whose character and values aligned with her own, whose presence enhanced rather than diminished her sense of self. The question was, what to do about it? The answer came on a Tuesday evening in late May, as they worked together on the Foundation's mission statement. They'd been debating the language around human dignity for over an hour, both passionate about getting it exactly right, when Emeka looked up from his notes and said something that changed everything. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a note of wonder, "I never expected to find someone who understood the world the way you do." The comment was casual, almost thrown away, but something in his tone made Sholola look up from her own writing. What she saw in his expression made her breath catch in her throat. He was looking at her with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with business partnership or friendly collaboration. His eyes held warmth and admiration, and something that looked remarkably like the feelings she'd been hiding from herself for weeks. "Emeka," she said, his name carrying a question she wasn't sure how to ask. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know there are reasons this might not be wise. But I have to tell you, these months with you have been the most meaningful of my life. The most meaningful of my life. Not because he'd rescued her, not because she'd been grateful, but because of who she was and what she brought to his world. I don't want to pressure you," he continued, his voice careful but determined. "I don't want you to feel obligated because of everything I've provided. But I also can't pretend anymore that my feelings are purely platonic. His feelings. Not just hers, not one-sided longing that would complicate their partnership. but mutual recognition of something real and valuable. "What are you saying?" she asked, needing clarity even though her heart was already providing answers. Emeka was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care he brought to everything that mattered. "I'm saying that I love you. Not because you needed rescuing, not because I helped you recover, but because of who you are. Intelligent, compassionate, strong, thoughtful. Because working with you feels like partnership in the truest sense. Because being with you makes me want to be the best version of myself. I love you," the words she'd stopped believing she would ever hear spoken with sincerity, offered freely without conditions or expectations. "I love you too," she said, the admission emerging with relief and joy and gratitude for the simple miracle of mutual affection. "I've been afraid to feel it, afraid to trust it. But I do. I love you." The smile that spread across Emeka's face was like sunrise after the longest night. He stood and moved around the desk to where she sat, then knelt beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands reaching for hers but stopping just short, waiting for permission even in this moment of declared love. "Are you sure this is what you want, and not just what feels safe?" The question showed understanding of her psychology that was both touching and necessary. He recognized that safety and love could become confused for someone who'd experienced prolonged abuse, and he wanted to ensure her feelings were authentic rather than strategic. "I'm sure," she said, taking his hands in hers and marveling at how different voluntary touch felt from obligated contact. "I love your kindness, but I'm not in love with your rescue. I love your character, your mind, your heart. I love who you are, not just what you've done for me. Who you are, not just what you've done for me." The distinction that made all the difference between gratitude and genuine affection. "Will you marry me?" he asked, the question emerging with such natural inevitability that it felt like the logical conclusion to everything they'd built together. "Yes," she said without hesitation, the word carrying certainty that surprised her with its completeness. "Yes, I will marry you." And as they kissed for the first time, gently, reverently, with the care of two people who understood the difference between taking and receiving, Lola realized that her story had become something she'd never dared to imagine. She'd gone from being thrown away like garbage to being cherished like treasure, from having her voice silenced to being asked for her opinions on everything that mattered, from being trapped in a marriage that was slowly killing her to being offered partnership with someone who made her feel more alive than ever. The woman who'd been left to die in a dump site was about to become the wife of one of the most respected men in Lagos, not because she'd been rescued, but because she'd used that rescue to rebuild herself into someone worth loving. And this time, the wedding would be a celebration of love rather than a business transaction. This time, the vows would be promises freely given rather than words spoken under duress. This time, marriage would mean partnership rather than ownership. The transformation was complete, but the real story was just beginning. The foundation was thriving 6 months after their wedding, having already helped dozens of women escape dangerous situations and rebuild their lives. Golola had become something of a quiet celebrity in Lagos's social service circles, the woman who'd transformed personal trauma into systematic change, who spoke about survival with the authority of someone who'd lived it and the wisdom of someone who'd learned from it. But success brought visibility, and visibility meant that her past was no longer as buried as she'd hoped. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, while she was reviewing applications for the Foundation's expanded housing program. The voice on the other end was familiar but unexpected. Chief Femi Ogundipe, calling with the strained courtesy of someone who needed something from a person he'd once considered disposable. "Skolola, my dear," he began, the endearment sounding forced and uncomfortable. "I hope you're well. I've been hearing wonderful things about your foundation work." Wonderful things about your foundation work, as if he'd always supported her endeavors rather than enabling her husband's attempt to murder her. "Thank you, Chief Femi," she replied carefully, her voice polite but cool. "What can I do for you?" A pause filled with the sound of papers rustling, and what might have been nervous throat-clearing. "I was hoping we could meet. There are some developments regarding Bofe that I think you should know about." Developments regarding Bofe. The name still had the power to make her stomach clench, but it no longer made her feel powerless. She was no longer the broken woman who'd been abandoned in garbage. She was Sholola Japan, successful businesswoman, foundation founder, beloved wife of a man who treated her like an equal partner. "What kind of developments?" she asked. "Perhaps we could discuss this in person. I'm at the Victoria Island Club. Could you join me for lunch?" The Victoria Island Club, where she'd once attended dinners as a silent ornament to Beaufait's reputation. Now she was being invited as someone whose time and attention had value. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, curiosity overriding caution. When she arrived at the club, Chief Femi was waiting in a private dining room, his usual commanding presence diminished by something that looked suspiciously like desperation. He stood when she entered, his greeting more deferential than she remembered. "Skolola, you look wonderful," he said, and for once the compliment seemed genuine rather than performative. "Marriage suits you. Marriage suits you." If only he knew how different this marriage was from the first one he'd arranged for her. "Thank you," she said, settling into the chair across from him with the composure of someone who no longer needed to fear powerful men's displeasure. "You mentioned developments regarding Bofe?" Chief Femi's expression grew troubled, aging him in ways that mere years hadn't managed. "He's in serious trouble, Sholola. Serious trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "Financial, primarily, but also legal and—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Personal." The story that emerged over the next hour was a masterpiece of poetic justice. After abandoning her at Olusosun, Bofe had returned to his old patterns with increased recklessness, but without a wife to serve as his emotional outlet and domestic manager. His behavior had spiraled beyond what even his family connections could protect. "The drinking got worse," Chief Femi explained, his voice carrying the weariness of a parent who'd finally run out of solutions. And with it, his judgment. He made some very poor business decisions, lost several major contracts. Poor business decisions, the euphemistic language of wealthy families discussing their black sheep's failures. "But that's not the worst of it," Chief Femi continued. "There have been incidents with women, multiple women, allegations of assault." Allegations of assault. Skolola felt a chill of recognition. Not surprise, exactly, but confirmation that Bofe's violence hadn't been specific to her, but part of a pattern that had been escalating since her departure. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Chief Femi shifted uncomfortably, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked remarkably like a desperation. "Because the family business is suffering. Because his behavior is affecting all of our reputations. Because I need him to stabilize." Stabilize. Another euphemism, this one suggesting that Chief Femi believed a wife's presence might somehow control his son's destructive impulses. "And you think I can help with that? How, exactly?" "By taking him back," Chief Femi said, the words emerging in a rush as if speed might make them more palatable. "By giving him another chance. by helping him remember how to be a proper husband. The suggestion was so absurd it almost made her laugh. Take him back. Return to the man who'd literally thrown her away like garbage, who'd tried to murder her, who was apparently now assaulting other women with the same casual cruelty he'd once directed at her. Chief Femi, she said, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a confused child. I'm married, happily married, to someone who loves and respects me. That marriage could be arranged to end. He said carefully, Emeka Japan is a reasonable businessman. I'm sure we could reach some accommodation, as if her current happiness was a business arrangement that could be renegotiated rather than a genuine relationship built on mutual affection and respect. Let me make sure I understand, Sholola said, her voice growing colder with each word. You're asking me to divorce my loving husband, to return to your son, who beat me, abandoned me to die, and is now apparently assaulting other women. When spoken aloud, the proposal revealed its complete absurdity. Chief Femi had the grace to look embarrassed, but he pressed on with the desperate persistence of someone drowning. You were good for him, he said pleadingly. You made him calmer, more stable. Maybe if he had that influence again. I was not good for him, Sholola interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through his delusions. I was a victim of his abuse. There's a difference. The distinction was crucial, and one that abusive families often struggled to understand. She hadn't been a positive influence that had helped Bofi control his worst impulses. She'd been a convenient target that had absorbed his violence and prevented it from spilling into areas where it might have consequences. But surely you understand the family's position, Chief Femi continued, apparently unable to process her refusal. The business, the reputation, the legacy. I understand perfectly, Sholola said, rising from her chair with the dignity of someone who no longer needed to tolerate disrespect. You prioritized business over my safety once before. I see nothing has changed. She was halfway to the door when Chief Femi's voice stopped her. He's lost everything, Sholola. The house, the cars, most of his money. He's living in a one-room apartment in Surulere, drinking himself to death. Is that really what you want? She turned back to face him, her expression calm but implacable. Chief Femi, I want exactly what I have. A life built on love rather than fear, partnership rather than ownership, respect rather than tolerance. What your son chooses to do with his life is his decision, and its consequences are his responsibility. But you could help him, he pressed. You could save him. I'm not his savior, Sholola said with finality. I'm not anyone's savior. I'm a woman who was lucky enough to be rescued when I needed it, and who's now dedicated to helping other women find that same luck. That was when inspiration struck. Not revenge exactly, but justice disguised as opportunity. Actually, she said, returning to her seat with renewed interest, there is something you could do for me. Chief Femi's face lit up with hope. Anything. Name it. Your family owns significant real estate throughout Lagos, correct? Yes, of course. I need a building for the Foundation's new headquarters. Something large enough to house our expanded services, counseling centers, job training facilities, temporary housing for women in crisis. Chief Femi's expression grew cautious. I suppose we could arrange something. A rental agreement at favorable terms. Not a rental, Sholola said firmly. A donation. Full ownership transferred to the Foundation, in perpetuity. A donation? Chief Femi looked like she'd suggested he set himself on fire. Of an entire building? Consider it restitution, she said calmly, for the damage your family has caused not just to me, but to all the women your son has hurt. A way to make something positive come from so much pain. The mathematics of justice were elegant in their simplicity. The family wealth that had enabled Beaufais's violence would now fund an organization dedicated to protecting women from similar abuse. And in exchange? Chief Femi asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. In exchange, you get the satisfaction of knowing your family contributed to something meaningful. Nothing more. Nothing more. No reconciliation, no return to the old arrangements, no salvation for the son who'd chosen destruction over decency. Chief Femi sat in silence for several minutes, his face cycling through emotions that ranged from anger to desperation to something that might have been recognition of inevitable consequences. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll have the lawyers draw up the papers. A building suitable for your purposes, transferred to the foundation." "Thank you," Xolola said, rising again. "The foundation will put it to good use." As she walked out of the Victoria Island Club for what she suspected would be the last time, Xolola felt the completion of something that had begun in the garbage dump, where Beaufais had left her to die. Not revenge. Revenge would have required her to hurt him in return. This was better than revenge. This was justice. His family's wealth being transformed into protection for the kinds of women he'd spent his life trying to destroy. His legacy being rewritten to fund organizations dedicated to everything he'd opposed. The woman he'd thrown away like garbage would soon own a building that would serve as a refuge for other women society had discarded. The voice he'd tried to silence would speak on behalf of the voiceless. The life he'd tried to end would be dedicated to saving others. It was poetic justice in its purest form, and it tasted like freedom. The grand opening of the Amara Haven headquarters took place on a crystalline Lagos morning that seemed designed by Providence for new beginnings. The building Chief Femi had donated was perfect for their purposes, a 5-story structure in the heart of Victoria Island, spacious enough to house all their services under one roof, while maintaining the warm, welcoming atmosphere that made healing possible. Xolola stood at the podium, looking out at a crowd that represented every chapter of her journey. Emeka sat in the front row, his pride evident in every line of his face. Mama Oge beamed from the staff section, surrounded by the team of counselors, lawyers, and support workers who'd joined their mission. Politicians, business leaders, and social activists filled the remaining seats, their presence a testament to how far the foundation had come. But it was the group of women in the second row that made Xolola's heart swell with the deepest satisfaction. These were the survivors, women who'd come to them broken and desperate, who'd found safety and support and the chance to rebuild their lives. Now they sat with straight shoulders and clear eyes, living proof that redemption was possible even after the worst experiences imaginable. 2 years ago, Xolola began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone to every corner of the room. I thought my story was ending. I believed I was worthless, disposable, deserving of whatever cruelty life chose to inflict upon me. The opening was stark, unflinching in its honesty about the depths from which she'd risen. In the audience, she could see heads nodding in recognition. Too many people understood what it felt like to believe they deserved nothing better than suffering. I was wrong, she continued, her voice gaining strength, not because someone came to rescue me, though rescue did come and I'm eternally grateful for it, but because I learned something fundamental about human nature that our society often forgets. She paused, letting the silence build as she made eye contact with faces throughout the crowd. Every human being has inherent worth. not worth that must be earned through perfect behavior or constant gratitude, not worth that can be revoked by circumstances or mistakes or other people's cruelty. Inherent worth, simply by virtue of being alive. Inherent worth, the principle that had been the foundation of her healing, and was now the cornerstone of everything the foundation represented. This building represents more than expanded services, though we're proud of those. It represents a commitment to treating every person who walks through these doors as someone who matters, someone who deserves safety and dignity and the chance to determine their own future. As she spoke, Sholola's mind drifted briefly to the journey that had brought her to this moment, the wedding that had felt like a funeral, the months of systematic destruction of her self-worth, the night in Olusosun when she'd been left to die among the garbage, the miraculous rescue that had given her a second chance at life, but also the harder work that had come after rescue, learning to trust kindness, rebuilding her sense of self, discovering that survival could become the foundation for thriving, rather than just continuing to exist. We named this organization Amara Haven because Amara means grace in Igbo, and grace is what we all need when life becomes unbearable. Not the kind of grace that makes us grateful for scraps, but the kind that reminds us we deserve abundance. Not grace that teaches us to accept less, but grace that empowers us to demand better. Grace that empowers us to demand better. The distinction between false humility that enabled abuse and genuine dignity that insisted on respect. Every woman who comes to us will find not just services, but recognition of her fundamental worth. Not just temporary relief, but tools to build lasting change. Not just sympathy, but genuine partnership in creating the life she deserves. As she outlined the Foundation's expanded programs, legal advocacy, job training, children's services, trauma counseling, financial literacy, Skolola felt the weight of responsibility that came with success. They were no longer just helping individual women. They were trying to change systems that created the conditions for abuse in the first place. But we cannot do this work alone, she continued, addressing the broader audience of potential supporters and allies. Changing the world requires all of us to examine how we contribute to either dignity or degradation in our daily interactions. The challenge was gentle but direct, asking everyone present to consider their role in creating a society where all people could thrive, rather than just survive. When she finished speaking, the applause was immediate and sustained, but it was the faces in the crowd that told the real story. Women who'd found hope in their darkest moments, men who'd learned to be allies rather than saviors, children who were growing up understanding that everyone deserved respect and safety. After the ceremony, as guests toured the new facilities and shared stories over refreshments, Olola found herself standing in the children's playroom, watching kids whose mothers had found refuge here, playing with the unconscious joy that came from feeling safe. "Penny for your thoughts," Emeka said, joining her at the window. "I was thinking about endings and beginnings," she replied, leaning into his familiar warmth. "How what feels like the worst thing that could happen sometimes becomes the doorway to the best thing you never imagined." "Do you mean that?" he asked gently. "Would you really choose to go through everything again if it led to this?" The question was complex, requiring her to weigh suffering against growth, trauma against transformation, loss against unexpected gain. "I would never choose the pain," she said thoughtfully. "But I can choose what to do with the wisdom that came from surviving it, and if my pain can be transformed into protection for other women, then it wasn't meaningless. It wasn't meaningless. The affirmation that even the worst experiences could be alchemized into something valuable if approached with intention and courage. "I'm proud of you," Emeka said simply. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become. Who you've become. Not who she'd been before trauma, not who she might have been without suffering, but who she actually was now. Stronger for having been broken, wiser for having been lost, more compassionate for having needed compassion herself." A commotion near the front desk interrupted their moment. Xolola looked over to see Mama Oge dealing with what appeared to be an agitated visitor, a man whose voice was rising above the pleasant hum of conversation. "I need to speak with her," the man was saying. "I need to speak with Xolola Japan. It's urgent." Something about the voice was familiar. Though Xolola couldn't immediately place it, she moved closer, Emeka beside her, until she could see the man clearly. It was Bofe. He looked nothing like the confident predator who'd once controlled her life. The man standing in their reception area was thin to the point of gauntness, his clothes wrinkled and ill-fitting, his skin carrying the grayish pallor of someone who'd been drinking too much and sleeping too little. His hands shook with a tremor that could have been alcohol withdrawal or simple nerves. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Hollow, desperate, carrying the particular kind of panic that came from having finally exhausted all other options. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Mama Oge was saying with firm politeness. "This is a private event." "You don't understand," Bofe said, his voice cracking with urgency. "I need to talk to her. I need to explain." "Mama Oge," Xolola said quietly, approaching with the calm composure of someone who no longer had reason to fear this particular ghost from her past. "It's all right. I'll speak with him." Bofe's head snapped up at the sound of her voice, his expression cycling rapidly through emotions that ranged from relief to shame, to something that might have been hope if it weren't so desperate. "Xolola," he breathed, her name emerging like a prayer from someone who'd forgotten how to believe in salvation. "Thank God. I wasn't sure I didn't know if you'd—" "Step outside with me," she said, not unkindly, but with the authority of someone who controlled the terms of any interaction. "We can talk on the terrace." Emeka moved to follow, but Xolola placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I'm okay," she assured him. "But stay close." The terrace was empty except for the two of them. Lagos spread out below like a city of infinite possibilities. In the distance, the lagoon sparkled with afternoon sunlight, its beauty unmarred by the memories of violence it had once witnessed. "You look," Bofe began, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to describe the transformation he was witnessing. "Different?" Xolola suggested with gentle irony. "Alive," he said finally. "You look alive in a way you never did when you were married to me." The words he couldn't bring himself to say hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. "I am alive," she confirmed simply. "More alive than I ever thought possible." Bofe's face crumpled, his composure finally breaking under the weight of whatever had brought him here. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words emerging like broken glass. "God, Xolola, I'm so sorry." The apology was raw, unpolished, carrying none of the calculated manipulation that had characterized most of his previous communications. This was the desperate honesty of someone who'd finally run out of lies to tell himself. "Sorry for what, specifically?" Xolola asked, not to be cruel, but because healing required accuracy rather than vague expressions of regret. "For everything," he said, then caught himself and tried again. "For hitting you, for the things I said, for making you feel worthless when you were—" He gestured helplessly toward the building behind them. "When you were always this, Always someone who could build something like this. Always someone who could build something like this. The recognition that her capacity for greatness had existed even when he'd been systematically trying to destroy it. For leaving you at that place, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. For wanting to kill me, Sholola finished for him, her voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. You can say it, Beaufet. Acknowledging what happened is part of taking responsibility for it. For trying to kill you, he repeated, the words seeming to cost him enormous effort. I don't know what was wrong with me. I don't know how I became someone who could do that to another human being. What was wrong with me? The question that had probably been haunting him since the moment he'd driven away from Olusosun, leaving her to die among the garbage. You became someone who saw other people as objects rather than human beings, Sholola said with the calm clarity of someone who had spent considerable time analyzing the psychology of abuse, someone who mistook control for strength and cruelty for power. The assessment was clinical rather than angry, delivered with the detachment of someone discussing a historical event rather than personal trauma. I know, Beaufet said, his shoulders sagging under the weight of recognition. I know that's what I was. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix anything or change what I did. Then why are you here? Sholola asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. Beaufet was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lagoon, as if it might contain answers to questions he barely knew how to formulate. Because I wanted you to know that what happened to me afterward, losing the business, the house, the money, everything, I deserved all of it. Because I wanted you to know that seeing what you've built, what you've become, it makes me understand how much I threw away when you threw me away, she finished. Yes, he said simply. When I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me. The best thing that ever happened to me. Sholola studied his expression carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only the devastating honesty of someone who had finally been forced to confront the full scope of his losses. I'm not the best thing that ever happened to you, Beaufet, she said gently but firmly. I was a person you were lucky enough to know who deserved better treatment than you gave me. The best thing that could happen to you now would be learning to see all people that way. All people, not just her, not just women he found attractive or useful, but every human being he encountered. I don't know how to do that, he admitted. I don't know how to be different than I was, the same way anyone learns anything difficult, Sholola replied. Practice, professional help, daily choices to treat people with dignity, even when it doesn't benefit you personally. The advice was practical rather than emotional, focused on behavior change rather than feelings or motivations. Is there, he began, then stopped, apparently uncertain whether he had the right to ask whatever question was forming. Is there what? Is there any chance you could ever forgive me? The question emerged in a rush, as if speed might make it more acceptable. I know I don't deserve it. I know what I did was unforgivable. But is there any possibility that someday, forgiveness? The question that had been lurking beneath every interaction, the thing he'd come here hoping to receive. Sholola was quiet for a moment, considering not just what she felt, but what kind of response would be most honest and helpful. I forgave you a long time ago, she said finally. Beaufet's face lit up with relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. You did? Not for you, she clarified quickly. For me, because carrying hatred was poisoning my ability to heal and move forward. Forgiveness was something I gave myself, not something I gave you. The distinction was crucial. Forgiveness as self-liberation rather than absolution for the forgiven. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, she continued. It doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't serious. It doesn't mean I trust you or want you in my life. It doesn't mean I trust you or want you in my life. The boundary was clear and non-negotiable. Forgiveness offered without the expectation of renewed relationship. I understand, Beaufet said, though his voice carried disappointment alongside acceptance. I needed you to know that I know what I lost. I needed you to know that I understand. You weren't the problem. I was the problem. The acknowledgement that abuse victims had been waiting centuries to hear from their abusers. I hope you get help, Sholola said, and meant it sincerely. Not because I think we'll ever have a relationship again, but because other people deserve to be treated better than you treated me. Other people deserve to be treated better. The expansion of concern beyond personal grievance to societal responsibility. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching Lagos continue its daily rhythm below them. Traffic flowing, people walking, life continuing with the indifference of a city that had witnessed countless individual dramas play out against its backdrop. I should go, Beaufet said finally. Thank you for talking to me, for giving me more than I deserved. Take care of yourself, Sholola said, the words carrying genuine goodwill despite everything that had passed between them. And get help, real professional help. After he left, Sholola remained on the terrace for a few more minutes, processing the encounter and its implications. The man who'd once terrified her had been reduced to a broken figure, seeking absolution from the woman he'd tried to destroy. The dynamic had completely reversed. She now held all the power, all the success, all the reasons to feel confident about the future. But more than vindication, she felt something like peace. The circle was complete. She'd survived his attempt to destroy her, built something meaningful from the wreckage of her trauma, and even found the grace to offer him hope for redemption without compromising her own boundaries. When Amika joined her on the terrace, his expression filled with concern and pride in equal measure. She turned to him with a smile that carried no shadows from the past. How do you feel? He asked. Free, she said simply. Finally, completely free. The woman who'd been thrown away like garbage had become someone who could afford to be generous, even with those who'd tried to destroy her. Not because she'd forgotten the pain, but because she'd transformed it into something larger than herself. The real victory wasn't that Beaufet had been reduced to begging for forgiveness. The real victory was that she no longer needed his acknowledgement to know her own worth. The real victory was that his opinion of her, positive or negative, was completely irrelevant to her sense of self. She was Sholola Japan, survivor, advocate, beloved wife, successful businesswoman, builder of institutions that would outlast all of them. She was living proof that grace could triumph over cruelty, that love could overcome abuse, that people discarded by society could rise to become society's conscience. And this was only the beginning of what she would build with the second life that had been given to her. 5 years later, Amara Haven had become a model that was being replicated across West Africa. The Foundation's comprehensive approach to supporting survivors of domestic violence, combining immediate safety with long-term empowerment, had proven so successful that delegations from other countries came to study their methods. Sholola stood in her office on the 5th floor of the headquarters building, reviewing applications for the Amara Haven Fellowship Program, which provided grants and mentorship to women starting their own advocacy organizations. Through the window, she could see the bustling courtyard where children played, while their mothers attended job training sessions or met with counselors. "The Minister of Women's Affairs is here for your 3 o'clock meeting," her assistant announced through the intercom. "Send her up, please," Skolola replied, setting aside the fellowship applications to focus on the policy discussions that were becoming an increasingly important part of her work. The transformation from garbage dump survivor to policy influencer still sometimes felt surreal, but she'd learned to own her authority rather than question it. Her lived experience, combined with the practical success of Amara Haven's programs, gave her a unique voice in conversations about systematic change. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting the minister. Instead, Ameka appeared in the doorway, carrying a small wrapped package and wearing the smile that still made her heart skip after all these years of marriage. "I thought you might want to see this before your meeting," he said, handing her the package. Inside was a book, the first published collection of essays by Amara Haven Fellowship recipients, titled From Darkness to Dawn, Stories of Survival and Transformation. Skolola's foreword was printed on the first page, but it was the dedication that made her eyes well with tears. "To Skolola Japan, who showed us that the women society throws away are often the ones who come back to save it." "The publisher called this morning," Ameka said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "They've already received orders from universities across 3 continents. Your story, all of your stories, are going to help people around the world. Your story. Not her trauma, not her victimization, but her complete story, including the transformation that had come after survival, the meaning that had emerged from suffering, the hope that had been built from despair. I never imagined," she said softly, "when I was lying in that garbage dump, that the worst night of my life would eventually become the foundation for the best years of my life. Maybe that's the real lesson," Ameka suggested, "that we never know which endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Which endings are actually beginnings in disguise." Skolola thought about all the women currently in Amara Haven's programs, many of whom had arrived believing their stories were over, their lives ruined beyond repair. Each of them was discovering what she'd learned, that rock bottom could become the foundation for rebuilding, that survival could become the basis for thriving. "Mrs. Japan?" Her assistant's voice came through the intercom again. "The minister has arrived, and there's also a young woman here who says she needs to speak with you urgently. No appointment, but she says it's an emergency." Emergency visits were nothing new. Women in crisis didn't schedule their need for help according to business hours. "Send the young woman up first," Skolola said. "Ask the minister if she can wait 15 minutes. The woman who entered her office was barely out of her teens, her face bearing the particular combination of fear and determination that Skolola had learned to recognize in recent survivors. Her clothes were expensive but disheveled, suggesting she'd fled from wealth rather than poverty. "Are you really Skolola Japan?" the woman asked, her voice shaking. "The one who survived?" "I am," Skolola confirmed gently. "What's your name?" Kemi Adebayo. "My husband, The words dissolved into tears that carried months of accumulated pain and terror. Skolola moved from behind her desk to sit beside Kemi on the couch, offering tissues and the kind of presence that communicated safety without words. She'd learned that sometimes the most important thing she could provide was simply believing someone's story without question or judgment. "You're safe now," she said quietly. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you've survived, you're safe now, and you have options, even if they're not visible to you yet." The conversation that followed was heartbreakingly familiar. Isolation, escalating violence, family pressure to make the marriage work. financial dependency that made leaving seem impossible. But it was also filled with the hope that came from speaking truth to someone who understood its weight. "I saw you on television last month," Kemi explained as her story wound toward its current crisis, "talking about how you built all this after your husband threw you away. And I thought, if she could survive what happened to her, maybe I could survive this. Maybe I could survive this." The phrase that had become the beginning of transformation for hundreds of women who'd found their way to Amara Haven's doors. "You can more than survive," Sholola assured her. "You can thrive. But first, let's focus on getting you safe and stable. Everything else can wait." An hour later, Kemi was settled in one of the Foundation's safe houses, connected with a counselor and a legal advocate, beginning the slow process of rebuilding her life on her own terms. It was a scene that played out dozens of times each month, each rescue a small victory against the forces that tried to convince women they were disposable. "How was she?" a maker asked, when Skolola finally returned home that evening, finding him in the garden tending to plants that had grown lush and abundant under his care. "Like I was," Skolola replied, settling beside him on their favorite bench. "Terrified, but determined. Broken, but not defeated. Ready to discover what her life could look like when it belongs to her, instead of someone else. Ready to discover what her life could look like when it belongs to her." The journey that every woman who came to them eventually took, from survival to ownership of their own story. "Do you ever wonder," Ameka asked, "what would have happened if I hadn't driven past Olusosun that night? If someone else had found you, or if no one had?" It was a question Sholola had considered many times, particularly in moments when she felt overwhelmed by the scope of suffering they encountered daily. "I think someone would have found me," she said with quiet certainty. "Maybe not that night. Maybe not in the way you did. But I think the universe has ways of ensuring that people who are meant to survive find what they need to heal. The universe has ways." A faith born not from naivety but from having witnessed countless small miracles in the lives of women who'd seemed beyond help. "Besides," she added with a smile, "I'm not the same person who was lying in that garbage dump. That woman was powerless, voiceless, convinced she deserved whatever cruelty life handed her. The woman I am now, she would have found a way to survive and thrive eventually. Because that's who I've learned I actually am. Who I've learned I actually am. Not who trauma had convinced her she was, not who abuse had tried to make her become, but who she'd always been underneath the layers of conditioning and fear." That night, as they prepared for bed in the home they'd built together, a space filled with laughter and books and plants and cats and all the signs of life being lived fully, Sholola caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused to really look. The woman staring back at her had silver threads in her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of both sorrow and joy deeply experienced. She looked like someone who'd lived rather than merely survived, someone who'd transformed pain into purpose and trauma into triumph. But most importantly, she looked like someone who knew her own worth. Not worth contingent on others' approval or performance or gratitude, but inherent worth that couldn't be diminished by circumstances or other people's cruelty. The woman in the mirror was Sholola Japan. Survivor, advocate, wife, friend, daughter of parents who'd loved her well, creator of institutions that would outlast her, live-in proof that human beings were remarkably good at healing when given the chance. She was evidence that society's throwaway people often became society's most precious treasures, that the voices that had been silenced often returned with the most important messages, that the women who had been discarded often came back to save others from similar fates. The story that had begun with a forced marriage and seemed to end in a garbage dump had become something she'd never dared to imagine. A legacy of hope that would ripple outward long after she was gone, touching lives she'd never meet, creating possibilities she'd never see. The woman who'd been thrown away like trash had become a treasure beyond price, not because someone had rescued her, though rescue had been crucial, but because she'd used that rescue to rebuild herself into someone capable of rescuing others. And in a world that seemed increasingly committed to discarding people rather than treasuring them, that transformation wasn't just personal victory. It was a revolution disguised as a love story, a masterclass in the alchemy of grace, a testament to the extraordinary things that could happen when someone decided that every human being deserved better than the worst that had been done to them. The revolution would continue tomorrow, one rescued woman at a time, one rebuilt life at a time, one transformed story at a time. Because that's what treasures do. They shine light into dark places. They reveal value where others see only waste. They prove that beauty can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. And Sholala Japan, former garbage dump survivor, current builder of hope, would spend the rest of her life proving that truth over and over again, one rescued treasure at a time.